Section 1. The Floating Timeline Conspiracy. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old since December 17th, 1989. That is the day the show premiered. That is the day Bart Simpson entered American living rooms as a spiky-haired, skateboard-riding, authority-defying 10-year-old boy. And if you turn on a brand new episode of The Simpsons today, right now, in 2025, Bart Simpson is still 10 years old. He has not aged a single day. Not a single birthday has passed that actually counted. Not a single growth spurt. Not one awkward middle school phase. Not one high school heartbreak. Not one moment where the show looked at itself and said, "All right, time to let this kid grow up a little." 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. And that fact on its own is something most people have made peace with. You watch enough animated television, you understand the deal. Characters stay the same age. It is a production decision. It keeps the show's formula intact. You are not supposed to pull at that thread. But here is the thing about pulling threads. Sometimes you find exactly what you expected underneath, which is nothing, just the mechanism of a television show doing what television shows do. And sometimes you find something else entirely. Something that makes you sit back and realize the thread was never just a thread. It was a wire connected to something much larger, something running underneath the entire foundation of 36 years of stories, and pulling it does not unravel the show. It illuminates it. The floating timeline in The Simpsons is not a production convenience. It is the show's central mystery. It is the fact around which every other theory orbits. And once you understand what the floating timeline actually implies, what it demands be true about Springfield in order for it to function the way it functions, the rest of the show begins to read very differently. So let us start there. Let us start with time, because time is where everything in Springfield breaks down first. The industry term for what The Simpsons does is called a floating timeline. The present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. They have smartphones. They reference current events. They interact with modern technology. The world around them evolves at the same pace the real world does. But the characters themselves do not evolve with it. They are anchored. They are frozen at the ages. They were in 1989, while the calendar keeps moving around them like a river flowing past a stone. This creates contradictions so enormous that they have become a genre of their own within Simpsons fan communities. The most dramatic example is Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their history was rooted in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during a specific era. There was era-appropriate music playing. There were fashions that placed the moment precisely in time. Homer's awkward courtship of Marge was framed by the cultural context of that period in American life, and it made complete sense for two people who would be in their mid-30s during the late 1980s. But the floating timeline does not allow that history to stay fixed. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, the math no longer works. They could not have met in 1980. If they are 38 years old today, they were born around 1987, which means they were toddlers when the show first depicted their teenage romance. The backstory has to move forward with the present, and the show has moved it forward multiple times, across multiple flashback episodes, each revision quietly overwriting the last one. Their high school years have been placed in at least 4 different decades across the show's run. In early flashback episodes, Homer is a teenager in the late 1970s. In later episodes, the same period of his life has been reframed to place it in the early 1990s. Then, the 2000s. There is an episode that frames Homer and Marge's courtship in a context that suggests they were teenagers in the grunge era, which is chronologically impossible given what earlier episodes established. The show simply does not acknowledge the contradiction. The new version replaces the old version without comment, and Springfield moves on. What this means, in practical terms, is that Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. Their history is not a history in the way that real people have histories, a sequence of events that happened in a specific order at specific times and cannot be changed. Their history is more like a sketch that keeps getting redrawn. The basic shapes remain. They met as teenagers, they fell in love, they had Bart earlier than planned, they built a life in Springfield, but the specific details, the era, the cultural context, the texture of the time period, those details are fluid. They reshape themselves to fit whatever the current episode needs them to be. And here is where it gets genuinely unsettling. If Homer and Marge do not have a stable past, then in a meaningful sense, they do not have a stable identity. Who you are is partly determined by what happened to you and when. The era you grew up in shapes your references, your assumptions, your understanding of the world. A person who came of age during Watergate is fundamentally different from a person who came of age during the early internet. Same basic personality, potentially. Same capacity for love and fear and humor. But different in ways that go all the way down to how they think about institutions, authority, technology, community. Homer's personality would be different if he actually grew up in the 1970s versus the 1990s. The show pretends otherwise, but the show is wrong, and the show knows it is wrong, and it does not care. Now, step back and ask the obvious question. Why not? Why does the show not care about this? Why has a writing staff full of Harvard graduates and brilliant comedic minds looked at this growing pile of temporal contradictions for 36 years and collectively decided to leave it alone? The standard answer is that fixing it would break the formula. If Bart ages, the show changes. If Homer and Marge age, the dynamic shifts. The family that America fell in love with is the family as it was, and changing it risks losing the audience that built the show into a cultural institution. This is true. It is a real and legitimate concern, and it is probably the primary reason the floating timeline has never been addressed in any meaningful way within the show's canon. But there is another answer. A stranger one. One that lives below the surface of the production decision and suggests that the floating timeline is not just a creative choice. It is a symptom. Consider what it would mean, within the logic of the show's own universe, for time to not pass in Springfield, not as a narrative convenience, but as an actual fact about the town. What would have to be true about Springfield, about its residents, about the forces operating within it, for the normal progression of time to simply stop working the way it works everywhere else? The radiation theory, which we will explore in much greater depth in a later section, offers one answer. If the Springfield nuclear power plant has been leaking radioactive material into the town's water supply, air, and soil for decades, and if that contamination has fundamentally altered the biology of everyone living there, then why should aging be exempt? The residents of Springfield already demonstrate biological traits that do not occur in normal human populations. They have 4 fingers on each hand. They have yellow skin. They survive physical trauma that would be immediately fatal to any normal person. Their bodies have already been altered at the cellular level by whatever is in the water and the air around that cracked cooling tower. Why should the cellular process of aging be immune to the same contamination that warped everything else? Under this reading, Springfield's residents do not age because they cannot. The mechanism that drives biological aging, the gradual degradation of cellular function over time, has been disrupted by chronic radiation exposure. This is not entirely science fiction. There are documented cases in the scientific literature of radiation affecting the aging process at the cellular level, both accelerating it in cases of acute exposure and potentially disrupting it in other, more complex ways in cases of chronic low-level exposure. The show has never engaged with this directly, but the show has also never given you a good reason to believe that the biology of Springfield residents works the way human biology normally works. The coma theory offers a completely different answer, and it is the one that lands hardest if you sit with it for a while. Under the coma theory, which we will examine in its own dedicated section later, nobody in Springfield ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who has been unconscious since April of 1993. Every episode that has aired since a vending machine fell on Homer Simpson in the episode titled, "So It's Come to This." A Simpsons clip show is a dream being generated by a comatose brain, and comatose brains do not let time pass the way waking brains do. They freeze the world at the last moment they experienced it. They run simulations of the people they love, but the simulations are locked. They cannot evolve because the sleeping mind does not have new information to feed them. Homer went under in 1993. His children were the ages they were in 1993. His wife looked the way she looked in 1993, and in the dream they will always be those ages, because Homer's unconscious mind cannot age them forward. It does not know who they became. This is the reading that the floating timeline supports most elegantly, because it explains the phenomenon without requiring you to invent any new rules about physics or biology. It just requires you to accept that the show is not what it appears to be, that the cheerful domestic comedy playing out on your screen every Sunday night is actually the internal experience of a man lying in a hospital bed slowly losing brain function, dreaming about the family he can no longer reach. But there is a third reading, one that does not require radiation or comas, one that is actually more disturbing than either of those options because it places the responsibility not on the power plant or on Homer's unconscious mind, but on Springfield itself. The town chooses not to age, not metaphorically, not as a side effect of something else, as an active, ongoing decision made collectively by the residents of Springfield, the same way they made the decision depicted in the episode called The Principal and the Pauper, where the entire town voted to sustain a lie rather than acknowledge a truth that would be too disruptive to absorb. Springfield has demonstrated, on screen, in canonical episodes, that it is capable of collective denial on a massive scale. The town has survived events that should have permanently altered its reality. It has been sealed under a government dome. It has experienced near-nuclear meltdowns. It has watched the sun be blocked out by a mechanical disc operated by the richest man in town. And after every one of these events, by the next episode, everything is back to normal. Nobody remembers. Nobody references what happened. The slate is clean. What if the floating timeline is just that mechanism operating on time itself? What if Springfield has collectively agreed not to notice that years are passing? Not through any supernatural intervention, not through radiation or dreams, but through the same social contract that allows the town to forget catastrophes and ignore mutations and pretend that a man who has been alive since the 1800s is just an eccentric elderly employer? The show has given us the mechanism. We have watched it operate in real time. The town does not forget things because of an external force acting on its memory. The town forgets things because remembering is dangerous. And if remembering that your children are getting older means acknowledging that time is passing, and if acknowledging that time is passing means confronting everything that time has revealed about Springfield, then the town has a very strong collective incentive to simply decide that time is not passing. This reading gives the floating timeline a quality that the standard production explanation cannot match. It makes the non-aging of Springfield's residents feel like a choice rather than a convenience, and choices have moral weight. The families of Springfield are not victims of a force outside their control. They are participants in their own temporal stasis. They press the pause button every morning when they wake up and choose not to notice that their children should be in their 40s by now. There is one more layer to this that the show has quietly built into its structure, and it is the one that makes the floating timeline feel less like a comfortable cartoon convention and more like something genuinely melancholy. The show has imagined its characters aging multiple times. In one of the most beloved episodes in the series, an episode from Season 6 called Lisa's Wedding, the story flashes forward roughly 15 years to show Lisa as a 23-year-old woman. She is engaged to a British man named Hugh. She is studying at a prestigious university. She has become, broadly, the person the show always suggested she would become. Intelligent, principled, somewhat isolated, searching for a kind of connection that Springfield never quite gave her. The future the episode depicts is detailed and specific and emotionally rich. It works. It is beautiful. It is one of the most moving episodes the show ever produced. And a significant part of why it moves you is that you can see how these characters you love would grow into themselves. You can see what time and experience would have made of them if time and experience were allowed to do their work. But the episode ends. Lisa returns to being 8 years old. Bart returns to being 10. The future is locked away like something too precious to leave out where it might get damaged, and the floating present resumes as if the glimpse through the window never happened. The show proved it could imagine growth. It chose not to allow it. And that choice, made thousands of times across 36 years of production decisions, is not morally neutral. It is an act of preservation that is also an act of denial. The Simpsons family is kept young and intact and unchanging, not because nothing can change them, but because we, the audience, and the show that serves us, refuse to let the change happen. And here is where the floating timeline stops being just a quirk of animated television and becomes a statement about something much larger. The Simpsons is not just a show. It has been the dominant depiction of the American family in popular culture for longer than most of its current viewers have been alive. It premiered when Ronald Reagan had just left the White House. It has run through 5 more presidencies. It has outlasted the Cold War, the Internet revolution, the smartphone era, the rise and fragmentation of social media, and about a dozen other cultural shifts that would have been unimaginable to the people who watched the first episode in 1989. And through all of it, the family has stayed the same. Homer is middle-aged and frustrated and deeply loving in his chaotic way. Marge is patient and creative and quietly strong. Bart is rebellious and loyal. Lisa is brilliant and lonely and idealistic in the face of a world that keeps disappointing her. Maggie is silent and watching and perpetually 1-year-old. The dynamic is preserved, the structure holds. The couch gag plays and the family assembles on the couch, and Springfield does what Springfield always does, which is absorb everything, reset, and begin again. Why? Why do we need this? Why has the American television audience watched the same family exist in the same eternal present for 36 years, when the entire premise of dramatic storytelling is that characters grow and change and eventually reach some kind of resolution? Because the Simpson family is not just a fictional family. They are a container for something the audience needs to keep safe. They represent a version of American domestic life that is simultaneously exhausting and comforting, chaotic and stable, deeply flawed and irreplaceable. They are the family you do not choose but cannot imagine being without. And if they age, if Bart goes to college and Lisa gets a career, and Maggie speaks and Homer retires, then the version of American family life they represent has to change too. It has to grow up. It has to face the fact that the world it was designed to reflect has been changing around it this whole time, and that the version of America that produced The Simpsons in 1989 is not the same America that exists today. The floating timeline protects us from that reckoning. It lets us sit down every Sunday and return to a world that feels like ours, but is frozen at the moment we loved it most. It is comfort food for the cultural imagination. And like all comfort food, it is not entirely honest. It offers the feeling of nourishment without the actual substance of it. Every theory in this video, every mystery we are going to spend the next 4 hours unpacking, circles back to the floating timeline eventually. Because the floating timeline is not just a setting, it is a diagnosis. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something that affects time itself. Something that keeps a 10-year-old boy from turning 11, keeps a family from evolving, keeps a town from facing what it has become. Whether that something is radiation or a coma, or collective denial, or the weight of an audience that refuses to let go, the result is the same. The clock stopped in Springfield. And the question that all the theories are really asking is not just what stopped it. The question is what it would cost to start it again. Section 2. The Burns Immortality Machine. Charles Montgomery Burns was born sometime in the late 1800s. The show has never fully committed to a specific birth year, and the inconsistency is itself part of the mystery. But every version of the timeline the show has offered places Burns's origins somewhere in that range. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described the Gilded Age not as a chapter in a history book but as a lived experience. He has mentioned working relationships with historical figures who died decades before most of the show's cast was born. He attended Yale. He served in World War II, though his role during that conflict was morally complex at best and deeply troubling at worst. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during that war and hid it for decades. By the most conservative estimate, Charles Montgomery Burns is somewhere north of 120 years old. By a less conservative reading of the show's scattered timeline clues, he could be approaching 150. The show does not settle this question because settling it would force a confrontation with implications the show prefers to leave unaddressed. But the implication is always there, sitting in the background of every scene Burns inhabits. This man should not be alive. And the show knows it. The show has addressed this directly, more than once, in ways that are played for comedy but carry genuine weight when you examine them carefully. The most significant moment comes in the episode called The Springfield Files, where Homer encounters what he believes is an alien in the woods near town. The entire episode builds toward a reveal, and when the reveal comes, it is not an alien at all. It is Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so extreme, so loaded with experimental compounds and carefully managed radiation exposure, that his body glows. He literally emits visible green light after each session. He wanders out of the treatment facility in a dazed, euphoric state and stumbles through the woods in the dark, looking for all the world like something that should not exist. The show frames this as a punchline. The alien is just Mr. Burns in a medical glow. Funny, surprising, move on. But the punchline contains an extraordinary amount of information that the show never stops to examine. Burns requires a weekly medical intervention to stay alive. Not monthly, not annually. Weekly. The margin for error in his survival is 7 days. Miss one appointment, and whatever equilibrium his treatments maintain collapses. The show states this explicitly. Without the treatments, Burns dies within a week. He is not surviving through any natural biological process. He is being maintained artificially through a regimen that has to be precisely administered on a precise schedule, the same way you maintain a complex machine through scheduled servicing. And the treatment involves radiation. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been documented to leak radioactive material into Springfield's water supply, soil, and air. The man who profits from nuclear energy and has spent decades ensuring that the safety violations in his facility never get fixed. This man is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological functions. He is not just profiting from radiation, he is powered by it. Consider what this means. Burns's body has been so fundamentally altered by his decades of proximity to nuclear material, combined with whatever the experimental treatment protocol involves, that it can no longer sustain itself through normal cellular processes. He requires external radiation input the way a normal human requires food and water. The treatments do not cure him of anything. They maintain a state of artificial equilibrium that his own biology can no longer maintain independently. Take the treatments away, and the equilibrium collapses, and everything that should have killed Burns over the past century surges forward simultaneously. This brings us to another moment the show plays entirely for laughs, but which is genuinely staggering in its implications. In an episode where Burns visits a doctor, the physician delivers a diagnosis that is one of the most quoted scenes in the history of the show. Burns, the doctor explains, has every disease known to medical science, every single one, simultaneously. All of them present in his body at the same time, all of them active, all of them attempting to run their normal course. But here is the thing. None of them is winning, because every disease Burns carries is competing with every other disease for the same biological real estate. They are all trying to kill him at once, and because they are all present simultaneously, they create a kind of biological gridlock. None of them can progress because all of them are blocking all of the others. The doctor calls this Three Stooges syndrome, after the comedic scenario where 3 people all try to fit through a doorway at the same time, and none of them can get through. Burns is the sickest man in America, the doctor concludes, but for precisely that reason, he may also be the hardest to kill. This scene is one of the funniest in the show's history. It is also, if you accept the radiation theory's framework, genuinely terrifying. Burns's disease equilibrium is not a natural state. No human body reaches that condition through ordinary biological processes. The simultaneous presence of every known disease, in perfect balance, is not a medical phenomenon. It is a managed state. And the thing managing it is the weekly radiation treatment. The treatments do not cure his diseases. They do not eliminate them. They calibrate them. They keep every illness in perfect stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining dominance and killing him. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. This framework recontextualizes the relationship between Burns and Smithers completely. Waylon Smithers is officially Burns's assistant. He manages Burns's schedule, coordinates his appointments, anticipates his needs, and maintains a level of devotion to his employer that the show has always framed primarily as a commentary on workplace power dynamics and repressed personal feeling. Smithers loves Burns. The show has made this explicit in multiple episodes across multiple seasons. His dedication to the old man goes far beyond professional obligation. But what if the dedication is not just emotional? What if it is also practical in a way that is much more fundamental than anyone in Springfield recognizes? Smithers is the only person who fully understands Burns's medical protocol. He manages the treatment schedule. He ensures Burns makes every weekly appointment. He monitors Burns's physical condition with a level of vigilance that looks like obsession from the outside, but reads differently when you understand what is actually at stake. If Burns misses a treatment, he dies within a week. Smithers knows this. Smithers has built his entire life around ensuring it never happens. The show has established repeatedly that if Smithers were ever removed from his position, Burns would become helpless. Not emotionally helpless, physically helpless. Without Smithers coordinating the treatment schedule, Burns would miss a dose. The disease equilibrium would collapse. Every illness his body has been maintaining in a state of artificial balance would suddenly have room to move, and the accumulated weight of over a century of ailments would crash down on him simultaneously. Smithers is not devoted to Burns out of love alone. He is devoted because he understands, at a level nobody else in Springfield does, that his absence is a death sentence. Smithers does not just love Burns. He is keeping Burns alive through logistical competence, and he knows it, and that knowledge is the deepest and most unacknowledged foundation of their entire relationship. Burns depends on Smithers not just for comfort and company but for biological survival. He is the most powerful man in Springfield, and he would be dead in a week without his assistant. Now let us talk about the history, because the history is where the Burns immortality theory becomes something larger than a single character's medical situation. Burns has not just been alive for over a century, he has been functional for over a century. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal politics with precision and sophistication. He orchestrates schemes that require sustained cognitive effort, long-term strategic planning, and a working understanding of modern finance, modern law, and modern technology that should be beyond the reach of a man whose formative years predated the automobile. His body is frail. He is physically weak to the point of being unable to open a child-proof bottle. But his mind is razor-sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, and he has been operating at that level of strategic intelligence for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained consciousness. This is worth sitting with. We tend to focus on the physical impossibility of Burns's survival, the fact that a man born in the 1800s is still walking around in the 21st century. But the cognitive impossibility is equally striking. The human brain deteriorates with age. Memory degrades. Attention spans shorten, processing speed slows. These are not optional features of human aging. They are biological inevitabilities, the result of cellular deterioration that accumulates over decades and cannot be reversed by wealth or willpower or any currently known medical intervention. Burns shows no meaningful cognitive decline. He is sharp, he is calculating, he is capable of remembering specific details, identifying specific people, and executing specific plans that require the kind of mental clarity that most humans lose well before they reach half of Burns's apparent age. However, his body is staying alive. Something is also keeping his brain functional in a way that defies the normal trajectory of human aging. The show has never addressed this directly, but it has given us one clue that points toward a possible explanation. Burns's medical treatment, the weekly radiation protocol that keeps his body glowing and his disease equilibrium intact, is described as comprehensive. It is not just managing his physical conditions. It may also be maintaining his neurological function, keeping the brain that runs his empire from suffering the same deterioration that would end a normal man's cognitive life decades earlier. If this is true, then Burns is not just rich and powerful. He is the only person in the world who has figured out how to maintain full cognitive function well past the point where cognition should have failed. And he has done it through the same nuclear technology that he has also used to poison an entire town. Think about the architecture of that for a moment. Burns discovered, either through experimentation or through some other means that the show has never revealed, that controlled exposure to radiation can sustain biological and cognitive function past their natural limits. He built a nuclear power plant in a residential area. He has been running that plant for decades with documented safety violations, leaking radioactive material into the water supply, the air, the soil. He benefits from the treatment protocol that radiation makes possible. He benefits financially from the power plant itself, and the people of Springfield who live inside the contamination zone that his facility has created receive none of the medical management that Burns uses to turn radiation from a hazard into a life extension tool. He knows the protocol. He knows what radiation does to biological systems at a cellular level, because radiation is literally keeping him alive. And the people of Springfield, drinking his contaminated water and breathing his contaminated air, have no access to any of the management strategies that Burns uses to ensure the radiation in his own body does what he wants it to do, rather than what it would do without management. Springfield is his uncontrolled experiment. He is the control group. Burns's connection to historical events adds another dimension to the immortality question. The show has depicted him interacting with or referencing an extraordinary range of moments in American history. He described the Gilded Age as personal experience. He knew Howard Hughes. He served in a war that ended 80 years ago. He has referenced events and people with the casual familiarity of someone who was present, not someone who read about them in a textbook. This is not just a quirky character trait. It is a window into a lifespan so extended that the normal human relationship with history has been completely inverted. For most people, history is something that happened before you were born, or before you were old enough to remember. For Burns, history is just an accumulation of things he personally witnessed. He does not study the early 20th century, he remembers it. He does not read about the figures who shaped that era. He met them. He dealt with them. He outlasted them. What does that do to a person? What does it mean for your relationship with other human beings when you have watched generation after generation of people born, mature, and die while you kept going? When the people around you are not your contemporaries but your descendants, in the sense that the world they inhabit was shaped by decisions you participated in making before their grandparents were born? Burns does not relate to the people of Springfield the way a normal employer relates to employees. He relates to them the way a geologist relates to sedimentary layers. They are evidence of the passage of time that he himself has transcended. They are temporary, he is not. And that fundamental difference in temporal status is probably the deepest source of the contempt that Burns displays toward ordinary Springfield residents. It is not just class contempt, though it is certainly that too. It is the contempt of something very old for things that do not last. And then there is the question of whether Burns is unique. The show has established that the Burns family predates the Industrial Revolution. Their wealth and power extend back centuries, in continuous family control of a fortune that was already ancient when Charles Montgomery Burns was born. This kind of multi-generational continuity does not happen through ordinary inheritance. Families fracture, fortunes dissipate, power erodes. The fact that the Burns family has maintained its position across centuries suggests either extraordinary luck or extraordinary measures, and Burns himself is not a man who relies on luck. The question the show has never answered is whether previous generations of the Burns family employed similar strategies. Before nuclear radiation, before modern medicine, before any of the technology that currently keeps Burns alive, did earlier members of the Burns dynasty find other ways to extend their control beyond what a normal human lifespan would allow? The show does not say, but it does establish that the Burns family has been in continuous operation longer than most American institutions, and that level of continuity is deeply unusual. It suggests a dynasty that has always found ways to ensure its own survival, regardless of what that survival costs the people around it. Here is the part of the Burns immortality theory that deserves the most attention and receives the least. Burns is not just surviving for himself. His survival is structural. Springfield's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns. Burns depends on the treatment protocol. The treatment protocol depends on the infrastructure that Burns's wealth maintains. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system where the man, the machine, and the money feed each other in a cycle that has no natural exit point. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. The power plant is the town's primary employer and its only source of electrical power. If Burns died and the plant shut down, or if it were seized by regulators who actually brought it up to code and assessed the cost of decades of environmental damage, the economic consequences for Springfield would be catastrophic. The town is not just psychologically dependent on Burns. It is materially dependent on him in a way that makes any serious challenge to his power effectively impossible. This is why the shooting in the Who Shot Mr. Burns episode, which we will examine in its own section, is so striking. Someone actually tried to remove Burns from the equation. They failed, and Burns survived, and the investigation ended with a baby being blamed and nobody seriously questioning whether the town's fundamental dependence on Burns might be the real problem that needed solving. The scariest thing about the Burns immortality theory is not that he might live forever. It is that Springfield is set up so that he has to. The system he built requires his continued existence to function. And systems that require a specific person's continued existence will find ways to ensure that person continues to exist, whether through medical infrastructure or legal protection, or the simpler mechanism of collective denial that keeps Springfield from ever seriously challenging the man at the top. Burns is not immortal. He is too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as the treatments keep coming and the reactor keeps running and the people keep drinking the water and not asking why the fish have 3 eyes. which, given what we know about what is in that water, is probably forever. Number. Section 3. Homer's Lost Intelligence. There is a version of Homer Simpson that you have never seen. Not the Homer who stumbles through Springfield, leaving a trail of property damage and empty donut boxes. Not the Homer whose IQ the show's own creator has stated is 55, which is not just low but clinically significant. The kind of cognitive impairment that in any real-world context would raise serious questions about a person's ability to hold a job, manage finances, or make informed decisions about their own life. Not the Homer who sleeps at his workstation, eats donuts during meltdown warnings, and once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into a reactor core to see if it would get bigger. There is another Homer, a Homer who exists within the same skull, behind the same glazed eyes, underneath the same unfortunate hairline. A Homer who emerged briefly in a season 12 episode and demonstrated something that the show has never fully reckoned with. Because when that other Homer appeared, when the fog lifted and the real cognitive capacity underneath became visible, the show looked at what it had revealed and quietly, carefully, put it away again. And the question of why that version of Homer had to be suppressed, what it would mean for Springfield if Homer Simpson could actually think, is one of the most quietly devastating mysteries the show has ever buried. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the series, but the beginning of Homer's particular brand of cognitive impairment. In the season 12 episode Homer the Mo, the relevant episode is called Home, and it reveals something extraordinary. Homer Simpson, adult male, safety inspector at a nuclear power plant, has had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood. Not metaphorically, literally. A crayon, pushed up through his nasal passage during a childhood incident, lodged itself in his frontal lobe and has been sitting there for decades, physically reducing his cognitive function. The crayon has been pressing on the part of his brain responsible for higher-order thinking, emotional regulation, and intellectual processing for essentially his entire conscious life. When the crayon is removed, Homer's IQ climbs to somewhere in the range of 105. The fog lifts. He becomes articulate. He becomes capable of processing complex information. He becomes, for the first time in his adult life, functionally intelligent. And the show spends the rest of the episode exploring what intelligent Homer is like, what he is capable of, how the world looks to him when he can actually see it clearly. What intelligent Homer discovers is that the world is terrible. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that makes for comfortable television. He discovers that the things he found funny or charming or acceptable when he was operating with diminished capacity are actually deeply troubling when examined with a functioning mind. He looks at his job and sees what it actually is. A safety-critical role in a dangerous facility, held by a man whose qualifications are catastrophically inadequate, in service to an employer who is actively undermining the safety standards that the role was designed to enforce. He looks at his social circle and sees the dysfunction clearly. He looks at Springfield and sees the contamination, the inequality, the structural corruption that the fog of his reduced cognition had always softened into background noise. Intelligent Homer is miserable. Not because he lacks the capacity to cope with reality, but because reality, seen clearly, is genuinely hard to cope with. He tries to share what he sees. He publishes a report pointing out the safety problems at the power plant. The report is accurate and damning. The town is briefly disturbed by it. Burns is briefly rattled. And then the town moves on, the way Springfield always moves on, and Homer is left with his enhanced intelligence and no ability to actually change anything with it. So he makes a choice. He has the crayon put back in. He voluntarily restores his own cognitive impairment. He chooses to return to the fog. He chooses the version of himself that cannot fully process the weight of his own situation, because processing it clearly was unbearable. The show plays this partly for comedy and partly for genuine pathos, and it handles the emotional landing reasonably well. But it stops short of asking the question that this storyline demands. Not why Homer chose the crayon. That part is understandable, even relatable, in a dark way. Ignorance has genuine value when the alternative is a clarity that changes nothing. The question the show does not ask is, how did the crayon get there in the first place? Homer had a childhood in Springfield. He attended Springfield schools. He presumably received some level of medical attention over the years. He went through the entire developmental period of his life with a foreign object lodged in his frontal lobe, an object that was measurably reducing his cognitive function, and not one medical professional in Springfield identified it. Not one doctor, not one scan, not one routine examination flagged the fact that Homer Simpson had a crayon in his brain. The possibilities here are actually quite limited. Either the medical professionals of Springfield are incompetent to a degree that strains credulity even by the show's standards, or they knew the crayon was there and chose not to remove it. Or the infrastructure through which a child in Springfield would receive medical care is so inadequate, so underfunded, so systematically neglected, that a detectable foreign object in a child's skull could simply go unnoticed for decades. All three of these possibilities are disturbing. The first two are disturbing in ways that point directly at Burns and at the question of who benefits from Homer's reduced intelligence. The third is disturbing in ways that point at the same target from a different angle, because who controls the economic conditions that determine the quality of healthcare available in Springfield? Let us sit with the second possibility for a moment, because it is the one that the show's overall architecture supports most strongly. Burns benefits from Homer's cognitive impairment in a direct, documented operational way. We know this because of what happened the one time the plant was briefly owned by someone else. German investors purchased the Springfield nuclear power plant. The first thing they did was fire Homer, not because they knew specifically about his limitations. They just applied normal industrial standards to a safety-critical role and concluded that the current occupant of that role was not qualified to hold it. They then assessed the cost of bringing the facility up to code, nearly went bankrupt from the estimate, and eventually had to sell the plant back to Burns. Burns immediately rehired Homer upon reacquiring the plant. He did not rehire Homer because Homer is irreplaceable. Homer is the opposite of irreplaceable. He is the most replaceable person in the facility. He is the person whose replacement would most dramatically improve the plant's safety record. Burns rehired Homer because a competent safety inspector would shut the plant down within weeks. Burns rehired Homer because Homer's incompetence is a feature, not a bug. The violations continue, the radiation keeps leaking, the water stays contaminated, and Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, and by extension over everything the power supply supports, which is essentially the entire town. If Burns understood the crayon, if someone in his medical infrastructure identified it and recognized what it was doing to Homer's cognitive function, then leaving it in place was not negligence. It was strategy. Homer's incompetence was protecting the power plant. Ensuring that Homer remained incompetent was as valuable to Burns as any other operational decision he made about the facility. And the conspiracy goes further, because of what the show reveals about the deal that Burns struck with Homer's father. It comes out in a later episode that Burns committed some kind of crime that Abe Simpson discovered. The show is deliberately vague about what the crime was, but the terms of the arrangement that followed are relatively clear. Burns guaranteed Homer a job at the plant, a permanent, unfireable position, regardless of his performance, regardless of his errors, regardless of how many documented safety violations he accumulated. 742 documented errors, and Homer was never permanently removed from his position because the deal made it impossible for Burns to remove him. On the surface, this looks like Burns doing a favor for an old man who had leverage. But look at it from the other direction. The arrangement guarantees Homer's continued presence in a safety-critical role that Homer is manifestly incapable of filling. It gives Burns the perfect justification for never improving the safety situation at the plant because the safety inspector is protected from firing by a legal arrangement that predates most of the violations. Anyone who tried to reform the plant would have to contend with the fact that the one person most responsible for enforcement cannot be replaced. Burns did not just accept Homer's incompetence. He institutionalized it. He built a legal framework around it that ensures Homer will be in Sector 7G for the rest of his working life, accumulating violations and going home satisfied, never quite capable of understanding the architecture of the situation he is trapped inside. Now bring in the radiation, because the crayon is not the only thing affecting Homer's cognitive function. The radiation theory, which gets its own full examination later in this script, suggests that the contamination from the Springfield nuclear power plant has been affecting the cognitive function of everyone in Springfield for decades. Radiation damage to neurological tissue is not instantaneous, it is cumulative. It builds up over years of low-level exposure, gradually impairing the cellular processes that allow the brain to function at its natural capacity. Homer has worked inside a nuclear facility in direct proximity to an active reactor core for his entire adult life. Whatever his baseline cognitive capacity was before he started working at the plant, it has been reduced further by every year he has spent inside that building. The crayon was doing damage. The radiation was doing additional damage on top of it. And Homer was ingesting the contaminated water and breathing the contaminated air of Springfield outside of work as well, compounding the exposure further. The man who emerged from the crayon removal episode, the Homer who could think clearly and write accurate reports and understand the implications of his own situation, that man was operating with a brain that had already been subjected to decades of additional radiation damage on top of the crayon damage. Even without the crayon, Homer's cognitive function had been significantly compromised by his environment. The Homer that Homer could have been. The Homer before the crayon and before the radiation and before the decades of compounding neurological damage, that Homer is genuinely unknowable. The show gave us a glimpse of what a partially restored Homer looked like. But the fully restored Homer, the Homer who never had the crayon and grew up somewhere without contaminated water and worked somewhere without a leaking reactor, is a person who may have been truly extraordinary. Someone who took after his mother, perhaps, who was herself brilliant enough to organize an effective raid on a germ warfare facility, articulate enough to sustain a political resistance movement for years, and principled enough to sacrifice her family life rather than compromise her integrity. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, was a genuinely impressive person. She was smart and passionate and capable of sustained commitment to things that were difficult. Her son, raised in Springfield, working in the nuclear plant, drinking the water, with a crayon in his skull and radiation doing ongoing damage to his neural tissue, became Homer. A man who is lovable and funny and deeply genuine in his affections, but also a man who is operating at perhaps 20% of the capacity he was born with. Burns did not just take Homer's mother. He took Homer's mind. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic act. Gradually, through the accumulating weight of environmental contamination and the strategic maintenance of the one specific person who could have identified the crayon and chose, possibly, not to. He took it incrementally, over years, in ways so small and so diffuse that no single act could ever be identified as the cause. The water was a little bit more contaminated each year. The reactor leaked a little more. The cognitive damage accumulated a little further. And Homer got a little further from the person he might have been. The tragedy of Homer Simpson is not that he is stupid. Homer is not stupid in the way the word is usually meant. He is damaged. And the damage was not accidental. It was produced by a system that needed him damaged to function the way it functioned. And the system belongs to the man who signs his checks and cannot remember his name. Homer will never figure this out. He chose to put the crayon back. He has spent his entire adult life working for the man who built the conditions that made him who he is. And every evening, Homer goes home to the family that Burns' actions shaped, sits on the couch in the house that runs on electricity from the plant that contaminated his brain, and laughs at whatever is on television, which is, depending on how you look at it, either the saddest thing in Springfield or the most deeply human. Section 4. The real story behind Maggie. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She has not talked, in any meaningful, sustained way, for 36 years. She communicates through pacifier noises, through pointed stares that convey more intelligence than most of the adults around her demonstrate in extended dialogue, and through the occasional gesture that, if you are paying attention, contains more information than it should be possible for a pre-verbal infant to convey. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old since 1989, and in that time, without saying a word, without walking reliably, without demonstrating any of the developmental milestones that typically mark the progression of a child's early years, she has done things that are genuinely extraordinary. She shot a billionaire. She led an organized rebellion in a daycare facility. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations in ways that required not just physical action but strategic planning, environmental assessment, and the execution of multi-step responses to rapidly evolving emergencies. She has been tested, in certain episodes, and found to possess an intelligence that the tests cannot fully measure, not because the tests are bad, but because the intelligence exceeds what the tests were designed to assess. And she has maintained her silence through all of it. Through every remarkable thing she has done, through every moment where she demonstrated capabilities that should be impossible in a child who has not yet learned to form sentences, Maggie has kept her mouth shut and her eyes open and let the world draw whatever conclusions it wanted to draw about the baby sitting quietly in the corner. This is not developmental delay. This is a strategy. Start with the daycare. The theatrical short film The Longest Daycare was released in 2012, ran in cinemas before a major animated feature, and was nominated for an Academy Award. It is 7 minutes long. In those 7 minutes, Maggie Simpson demonstrates something that the nomination implicitly acknowledges, but never quite says out loud. This is not a baby. Not in any way that the word is normally understood. The premise is simple enough on its surface. Maggie is dropped at a daycare facility that is run with something approaching authoritarian efficiency. The facility sorts children by intelligence on arrival, and Maggie is sorted into the lowest category, which tells you something immediately about how this particular institution misreads its charges. Inside, Maggie discovers a caterpillar about to undergo metamorphosis, and she wants to protect it from a bully named Gerald who wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film in which Maggie outmaneuvers Gerald, the daycare staff, and the physical security of the facility to save the caterpillar and release it. She does this without speaking. She does it through observation of the environment, identification of threats, rapid reassessment when her initial approaches fail, development of alternative strategies on the fly, and the execution of a multi-step plan that requires timing, spatial awareness, and a working predictive model of how other people will behave under specific conditions. That last one is worth emphasizing. Predicting other people's behavior requires what psychologists call theory of mind. The understanding that other people have internal states, beliefs, desires, and intentions that differ from your own and that determine their actions. Theory of mind is not fully developed in typical human children until around age 4. Maggie, as established by the show, is 1 year old. She should not have theory of mind in any meaningful sense. She absolutely does. She not only understands that Gerald and the staff have intentions that differ from hers, she accurately predicts what those intentions will lead them to do under specific circumstances, and she plans around those predictions. Her body can barely keep up with her mind. She falls, she stumbles, she crawls when she should be running. Every physical limitation of a 1-year-old is fully present, but every cognitive limitation of a 1-year-old is entirely absent. She is operating at a level of strategic intelligence that her physical development cannot support, and she compensates for every physical shortcoming through better planning, better observation, and better anticipation of what she will need to do next before the moment arrives when she needs to do it. And then, when the butterfly is free and the episode ends, she goes back to being the silent baby in the corner. Now, look at the shooting. We examine the full Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery in its own section, but the aftermath of that event is what matters most for understanding Maggie. A baby was identified as having shot the richest man in Springfield. The police investigated. The evidence was examined, and the official conclusion was that yes, this infant committed an act of violence against a grown adult, and there is nothing to be done about it because, as Chief Wiggum put it, no jury in the world would convict a baby. Case closed. Move on. But the final shot of that episode is the one that changes everything. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around, carefully and deliberately, in a way that is not the random head movement of an infant registering stimuli, but a purposeful scan of the environment to confirm that no one is watching. Having confirmed that the room is empty, she moves her pacifier in a motion that precisely mimics the action of pulling a trigger. Let us be very precise about what this requires. To perform that sequence of actions, Maggie had to first recognize that she was being observed, while others were present. She had to decide, based on that recognition, that performing the gesture was inadvisable while the room was occupied. She had to wait until the room cleared. She had to verify that it had cleared. And then, having confirmed her privacy, she chose to reenact the shooting, privately, for no audience but herself. That is not reflexive behavior. Babies do not plan when to perform actions based on social awareness of who is watching. That requires self-consciousness, environmental monitoring, memory of the triggering event, evaluation of the risk of being observed, and the impulse control to wait until the risk has passed. These are not traits associated with infants. These are traits associated with someone who understands consequences, manages exposure to risk, and makes calculated decisions about when it is safe to reveal information about themselves. Maggie is 1 year old and she is running operational security. The theory that the Maggie chapters of this script are building toward is simple and strange and, once stated, very difficult to unsee. Maggie's silence is not a developmental feature. It is a choice. A rational, sustained, strategic choice made by a mind that is intelligent enough to understand the value of not being noticed, maintained across 36 years of episodes, because the conditions that made the choice rational have not changed. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is a genius. Her IQ is somewhere in the range that places her among the most intellectually capable people in Springfield, possibly in a much larger radius than Springfield. She is creative, curious, principled, and driven by a desire to understand the world and make it better. She has all the raw materials for an extraordinary life. And she is miserable. She is isolated, she is mocked, she is dismissed. She is repeatedly ignored by institutions that should celebrate her, undervalued by a community that does not know what to do with a child who is smarter than the adults around her, and exhausted by the constant effort of fighting for recognition in an environment that consistently fails to provide it. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. Lisa challenges authority and gets punished. Lisa tries to make things better and encounters resistance that is both institutional and deeply personal. Maggie watched this happen. Maggie has been watching it happen since she was old enough to observe the dynamics of the household she was born into. She watched the smartest person in the family fight every single day for recognition, and she watched what that fighting cost Lisa. The isolation, the frustration, the way that Springfield's resistance to intelligence grinds down even the most determined person over time. And Maggie drew a conclusion. Not the conclusion Lisa drew, which is that the fight is worth it regardless of the cost. Maggie drew the opposite conclusion. Visibility is a liability. Being noticed means being evaluated, being underestimated in certain ways and overestimated in others, being put in categories that do not fit, and being held to expectations that do not match what you actually are. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. The less they notice you, the more you can accomplish. The less they know about what you are capable of, the less they can do to constrain it. Consider the practical implications of this in Maggie's specific situation. Every remarkable thing Maggie has done has happened below the radar. The daycare rebellion succeeded because nobody monitors infants closely enough to perceive them as an organized threat. The shooting went uninvestigated as a serious crime because no one suspects a baby of intentional violence. Every display of intelligence, every moment where Maggie intervened decisively in a crisis, happened in spaces where the adults around her were not paying attention. And Maggie ensured that they were not paying attention by maintaining the most effective disguise available to her. She pretends to be exactly what everyone expects a baby to be: passive, helpless, dependent, precognitive. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of all of them. She is the most cognitively capable member of the Simpson family by a significant margin, and she has spent 36 years making absolutely certain that nobody figures that out. Now apply the radiation framework. If the environmental contamination from the Springfield nuclear power plant has been affecting the biology of everyone in Springfield, altering their physiology, their cognitive function, their aging, then Maggie represents the other end of the spectrum from Homer. Homer's radiation plus crayon situation resulted in a dramatic reduction of his cognitive capacity. He was rendered, through the combination of environmental contamination and physical brain damage, significantly less capable than he might otherwise have been. But mutations do not all run in the same direction. The same environmental trigger can produce wildly different outcomes in different individuals, depending on the specific nature of their biology, the timing of the exposure, and 100 other variables that determine how a given organism responds to a given environmental stress. In some organisms, radiation exposure causes deterioration. In others, in rare and unpredictable cases, it can trigger something else entirely. Maggie's mutation went the other direction. Where Homer was diminished, she was amplified. The same contaminated water, the same irradiated air, the same shadow of the cracked cooling tower falling over the same house on Evergreen Terrace. But where her father's brain was eroded by what Springfield's environment produced, her brain was accelerated, supercharged in some direction that the show can gesture toward, but has never fully mapped. She has intelligence at a level that exceeds what the show's standardized testing can measure, not because the tests are poorly designed, but because whatever happened to her cognitive development pushed it into territory. The tests were not built to assess Homer and Maggie are two sides of the same contaminated coin. He is what happens when mutation takes something away. She is what happens when it gives something that was never supposed to be there. And then there is the reading that sits alongside the radiation theory, the one that is quieter and sadder and comes from the coma framework. If Homer has been dreaming since April of 1993, if every episode since the vending machine fell on him is a simulation generated by an unconscious brain in a hospital bed, then Maggie's genius is not a mutation. It is Homer's deepest wish for his youngest child, projected into the dream. He cannot see her grow up. He cannot watch her walk or talk or learn what kind of person she becomes. He cannot hear her voice develop from baby sounds into words, and then into sentences, and then into whatever kind of language a person with Maggie's mind would eventually develop. He cannot protect her from the things that are going to happen to her after the vending machine falls. He cannot be there. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her age, capabilities that mean she does not need his protection because she can protect herself and everyone around her. He makes her the most powerful person in Springfield not because the evidence supports it, though the evidence does support it, but because an unconscious father lying in a hospital bed needs to believe that his baby girl is going to be okay even without him there to watch over her. Maggie's genius, in this reading, is not a mutation or a biological fluke. It is a father's prayer encoded into the architecture of a dream that will not end. It is the thing Homer's mind reached for when it could not reach for anything else, when the only comfort available was the invention of a child so capable that no one and nothing could ever harm her. That is Maggie under the coma theory, a love letter written in cognitive ability, given by an unconscious man to the daughter he cannot reach. But back in Springfield, in whatever version of Springfield is real, there is a darker reading that sits underneath all of this and refuses to be fully dismissed. Maggie does not speak because speaking gets you nothing in this town. She does not reveal her intelligence because intelligence is punished in Springfield. She watches everything. She remembers everything. She understands everything. And she waits. For what? The show never tells us. Maggie's endgame is the last truly unsolved mystery of the Simpson family because the show has never definitively revealed the full scope of what she is planning or what she intends to do with the extraordinary capabilities she has been quietly accumulating for 36 years of silence. But we have seen glimpses. We have seen her shoot a man. We have seen her command a room full of babies in organized resistance to an adult authority structure. We have seen her solve problems that stump the adults around her. We have seen her confirm or deny information with a single nod that somehow carries the weight of a full legal testimony. And the family trusts her judgment in those moments, implicitly, without question, as though some part of them knows, even if they cannot articulate it, that Maggie sees things they cannot see and understands things they cannot understand. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She cannot reliably walk. She cannot speak beyond isolated sounds. She is, by every external measure, the most helpless member of the most dysfunctional family in the most comprehensively troubled town in the history of American animated television. She is also the most dangerous person on Evergreen Terrace, possibly in Springfield, and she has not yet decided what to do about it. That is what lives behind the pacifier, behind the enormous eyes that track everything, behind 36 years of deliberate, strategic, brilliantly maintained silence. Something is thinking. Something is planning. Something is watching the town and the family and the show itself with an intelligence that nobody around her suspects and nobody could contain if they did. And when Maggie finally decides the moment has come, when she finally puts down the pacifier and speaks, Springfield will not see it coming, because that is exactly how she designed it. That has always been exactly how she designed it. Section 5. The Springfield Nuclear Conspiracy. Let us talk about the water. Springfield's water supply flows from sources that have been confirmed within the show's own canonical universe to be contaminated by radioactive runoff from the nuclear power plant. This is not a fan inference. This is not something you have to read between the lines to find. The show has shown you a three-eyed fish pulled from the river near the plant. It has shown you that river. It has shown you the connection between the river and the plant's waste output. And it has shown you a gubernatorial candidate using that three-eyed fish, named Blinky, as campaign evidence that the plant is poisoning the environment. The candidate lost. Burns ate the fish on live television to demonstrate it was harmless. The town moved on. Nobody tested the water. Nobody conducted a follow-up study. Nobody asked the obvious question. If the fish have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people drinking the same water? The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns. It is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town, and it is, by any reasonable standard of measurement, one of the most dangerous industrial facilities in the history of fiction. A surprise safety inspection documented 342 violations. 342. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million. Burns refused to pay it, not because he could not afford it. Burns is a billionaire many times over. He refused because fixing the problems would mean admitting they existed, and admitting they existed would mean someone might start asking questions about what those problems had already done to the people living downwind. The violations are not minor paperwork issues. They include radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water, radioactive waste being disposed of on children's playgrounds, plutonium being used as a paperweight on someone's desk, cooling towers patched with chewing gum, luminous rats running through the facility's lower levels, and one detail the show drops with casual horror and never revisits: human skeletons in the basement. Not animal remains, not industrial debris. Human skeletons in the basement of an operating nuclear power plant. The show never explains who those people were. It never asks how they got there. It shows you the bones and moves on. And not one person in Springfield, not one investigator, not one reporter, not one concerned citizen looks at that detail and demands an answer. That detail is the key to understanding the Springfield nuclear conspiracy, because it is the moment where the comedy of incompetence stops being comedy. A nuclear facility with human remains in its basement is not a poorly run workplace. It is a crime scene. And the fact that the crime was never investigated, that the evidence was seen by people with the authority to act, and those people chose not to act, tells you something about the infrastructure of silence that surrounds the plant. Burns has that infrastructure. He has built it carefully, across decades, through a combination of financial influence, institutional corruption, and the strategic management of who occupies positions that could threaten his operation. Homer's presence in the safety inspector role is the most visible component of this infrastructure, but it is not the only one. Consider the regulatory environment. The nuclear power industry is regulated at both the state and federal level. There are multiple agencies with jurisdictional authority over a facility like the Springfield plant. The fact that 342 documented violations exist without producing meaningful regulatory consequences is not an accident of bureaucratic inefficiency. It is an outcome that requires active management. Someone has to be ensuring that the regulatory process produces acceptable results for Burns at every stage. And that kind of regulatory capture does not happen without investment. Burns invests. He buys politicians. He funds campaigns. He cultivates relationships with the people who write the rules and the people who enforce them. This is established across many episodes. Springfield's political landscape is essentially a client state for Burns's interests. Mayor Quimby is corrupt and malleable. The police department is underfunded and easily managed. The legal system in Springfield has demonstrated, multiple times, a flexibility about evidence and procedure that is not characteristic of a functioning justice apparatus. The plant operates with impunity because Burns has made impunity the baseline condition of its operation. And the people of Springfield, drinking the water and breathing the air and eating the food grown in soil that receives runoff from the same contaminated water supply, have been doing so for decades without ever achieving the sustained collective action that would be required to force meaningful change. Why? The radiation theory offers an answer that is simultaneously the most elegant and the most disturbing. The same contamination that is producing the environmental and biological anomalies visible in Springfield's residents is also affecting the cognitive function that would be necessary for those residents to mount effective resistance to Burns's operation. This is not a unique mechanism. There is a real-world phenomenon sometimes called the lead crime hypothesis, which suggests that widespread lead contamination in the mid-20th century, primarily from leaded gasoline and lead paint, significantly impaired the cognitive development of an entire generation of children, with measurable downstream effects on impulsivity, planning capacity, and executive function. The hypothesis is controversial in its full scope, but the underlying mechanism, that environmental neurotoxins can affect the cognitive function of populations is not controversial at all. It is well established. Now, apply that mechanism to a town with a leaking nuclear reactor as its primary employer and sole source of electrical power, a reactor with 342 documented safety violations, including direct radioactive waste disposal into local water sources. If heavy metal contamination from leaded gasoline could produce measurable population-level effects on cognition, what would chronic low-level radiation exposure from a poorly maintained nuclear facility do to a town's collective ability to think clearly, plan effectively, and sustain the kind of organized resistance that challenging a billionaire's industrial operation requires? The answer that the radiation theory proposes is exactly what you observe in Springfield. A population that riots over trivial things but cannot sustain meaningful action on genuinely important ones. A town that responds to immediate emotional provocations with intense energy but cannot maintain the focused, long-term strategic engagement that real institutional change requires. A community that collectively, repeatedly forgets the catastrophes that should motivate it to demand better and returns to a comfortable passivity that serves the interests of the man whose plant produced the contamination that impaired the cognitive function that prevents the sustained action that might actually address the problem. Burns does not need to actively suppress resistance in Springfield the way a dictator suppresses dissent. He does not need to imprison protesters or threaten journalists or deploy violence against organizers. The contamination does that work for him passively, continuously, invisibly. Every year that the plant runs with its violations unfixed, the population's capacity for the sustained intellectual engagement that meaningful opposition requires is incrementally reduced. It is the most elegant possible system of social control, because the people subject to it cannot perceive it. You cannot notice the gradual erosion of your own cognitive function while it is happening. You cannot remember clearly enough to track the pattern across decades of low-level exposure. You cannot maintain the focused attention required to connect the dots between the three-eyed fish and your own inability to organize effectively. And the person most positioned to notice, the safety inspector whose literal job description is to understand what the plant is doing and report it accurately, is Homer Simpson. A man with a crayon in his brain, decades of radiation exposure compounding the damage, and a constitutional inability to connect information across time in ways that would reveal a pattern rather than just a series of isolated events. The Simpsons movie makes the nuclear conspiracy visible in a way that the television series can gesture toward but never fully commit to. In the film, Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a point so catastrophic that the Environmental Protection Agency, operating within the show's universe as a real federal agency with real authority, determines that the town must be physically contained. A massive glass dome is placed over Springfield to prevent its pollution from spreading to the surrounding region. Think carefully about what this means. The United States federal government, within the show's own canon, assessed Springfield's environmental situation and concluded that the town itself was so toxic, so comprehensively contaminated, that the only viable response was to physically seal it off from the rest of the country. This is not a metaphor. This is the EPA using emergency powers to quarantine an American town because the contamination level has exceeded any threshold at which normal remediation is considered viable. Springfield is not just polluted. Springfield is classified as an environmental hazard by the federal government. The town is a contamination zone. Every resident who has been living there for decades, every person who has been drinking that water and breathing that air and eating food grown in that soil, has been inside the contamination zone the whole time. And when the dome goes up, they are still inside it. The dome seals them in with the contamination that has been building for decades. It is the ultimate expression of what the nuclear conspiracy has always been doing in slow motion. Springfield was always sealed. The contamination was always inside. The dome just makes the invisible wall visible. Now look at the residents. Look at them the way the radiation theory demands. Homer Simpson, massive overbite, bulging eyes, 4 fingers on each hand, a skull shape that does not correspond to normal human anatomy, an IQ that places him in the range of clinical cognitive disability, a body that can absorb injuries that would kill a normal human being 10 times over. He has been shot, electrocuted, fallen off cliffs, struck by cars, survived explosions, and recovered from all of it. His healing rate is not just unusual, it is impossible by the standards of normal human biology. Marge Simpson. The same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers, hair that defies the laws of physics and gravity, growing straight up in a configuration she has maintained without apparent effort for 36 years. Marge was briefly employed at the power plant herself. She was exposed to the same facility, the same violations, the same leaking radiation. Her children were all born after both parents had already been living in Springfield's contaminated environment for years. Bart, Lisa, Maggie, born in Springfield, raised in Springfield. Their entire biological development occurred inside the contamination zone, drinking the contaminated water, breathing the contaminated air, living under the shadow of those cracked cooling towers every day of their lives. All of them display physical characteristics that do not occur in normal human populations. The spiky hair that maintains its shape without product, the overbites, the bulging eyes, the yellow skin. The yellow skin is the detail that the radiation theory keeps returning to because it is the most visible and the most systematically observed marker of Springfield's difference from the world outside it. Every resident of Springfield is yellow, not in a jaundiced way, not in a way that suggests a specific illness or a temporary condition. A deep, consistent, entirely characteristic yellow that covers every person who was born in or lived in Springfield for any significant period. And the town accepts this as normal, because for Springfield it is normal. Everyone around you is the same color. You have no reference point for anything different. But the show provides that reference point, and it has been providing it consistently since the earliest seasons. When celebrities visit Springfield, when guest characters arrive from outside the town, they look different. Not slightly different. Fundamentally different. More natural proportions. Eyes that are closer to normal size. Features that more closely resemble the anatomical reality of actual human faces. The show draws outsiders with markedly different visual conventions than it uses for Springfield residents. The standard explanation is that this is just the show's art style. Springfield residents look the way they look because that is how the show depicts its regular cast, and guest characters are drawn to look more like the people they are based on in real life. But within the logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible, observable, systematic difference between people who live in Springfield and people who do not. The people inside the contamination zone look mutated. The people outside it look like what human beings are supposed to look like. The art style explanation is satisfying from outside the fiction. Inside the fiction, it is a difference that demands a cause. And the cause is right there, in the background of every exterior shot of Springfield. The cooling towers of the nuclear plant, cracked and patched and leaking, producing the invisible poison that has been reshaping the people who live in their shadow for 36 years. Even the animals are affected. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes as his owners, proportions that deviate from real canine anatomy in the same ways that the Simpsons' proportions deviate from real human anatomy. Blinky the three-eyed fish is the most famous example, but he is not an isolated anomaly. He is evidence of a systematic environmental effect that operates on every living organism within the contamination zone, regardless of species. The show told you this directly. It showed you a three-eyed fish and said, "This is what the radiation is doing to living organisms." And then it asked you to believe that the exact same radiation, from the exact same source, administered through the exact same contaminated water supply, had somehow produced zero effects on the humans drinking from that same supply. That is not a conclusion. That is a denial. And Springfield is very good at denial. Burns knows what he is doing. This is not a case of negligent ignorance. Burns has private medical infrastructure. He has personal physicians. He undergoes weekly treatments that manage his own radiation exposure with precision and sophistication. He understands radiation biology at a level that nobody else in Springfield approaches because he has spent decades using radiation to sustain his own biological functions. He knows what it does to tissues at the cellular level. He knows what controlled exposure looks like versus uncontrolled exposure. And he knows what the difference between those two things produces in a population of people who have no access to the management strategies that keep his own exposure under control. Burns is not accidentally poisoning Springfield. He is knowingly poisoning Springfield and choosing not to fix it, because fixing it would cost him $56 million and would require him to acknowledge that there was something to fix, and acknowledging that would open the door to questions about what 30-plus years of unfixed violations had already done to the people living downwind. Springfield is not just Burns's company town, It is his laboratory. And the experiment has been running for 36 years, with the entire population as unwitting subjects, and nobody in any position of authority has been willing to look at the results clearly enough to understand what they are seeing. The nuclear conspiracy is not a theory that requires you to believe in shadowy cabals or secret meetings or any of the more elaborate machinery of conspiracy thinking. It just requires you to believe that a very rich and very old man, with documented contempt for the people he employs, has made the rational decision, from his perspective, to protect his financial interests at the expense of the population that makes those interests possible, and that the systems that should prevent this from happening, regulatory bodies, elected officials, medical professionals, legal institutions, have been sufficiently influenced by that man's wealth and sufficiently impaired by the conditions his facility produces to fail at every opportunity to intervene. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a description of how industrial contamination has operated in the real world, in real American communities, many times across the past century. Springfield just does it with yellow people and three-eyed fish. Number, Section 6. The Coma Dream Theory. On April 1st, 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. It was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was simple. Bart plays a series of April Fool's Day pranks on Homer, each one escalating in ambition and destructive potential, until he takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. The shaken can is returned to the refrigerator. Homer finds it. Homer opens it. The explosion is violent enough to send Homer to the hospital. Homer is lying in his hospital bed when he sees a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He reaches for the machine. The machine tips over. It crushes Homer, and Homer Simpson enters a coma. A real coma, not a cutaway, not a dream sequence, not a comedic exaggeration of a brief, unconscious period. Homer flatlines. He enters a clinically unconscious state that the episode describes as lasting 7 weeks. His family gathers by his bedside. His friends visit. Springfield holds a vigil of sorts, and at the end of the episode, Homer appears to wake up. Bart confesses through tears that the whole thing was his fault, and Homer springs to life and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs. Everything goes back to normal. The show tells you he woke up, but the show also tells you something else. In the final moments of the same episode, during the coma, Homer lost 5% of his brain function. 5%, gone, destroyed, not recoverable. Not a temporary impairment. A permanent reduction in functional brain capacity from a brain that was already operating with significant deficits. Homer's response to being told about this permanent brain damage is to laugh, while simultaneously stating that he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. The Simpsons continues for 32 more years as if the event never happened. Unless it never did. Unless Homer never woke up at all. The Homer coma theory is the single most popular, most debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. Its basic premise is straightforward. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April of 1993. Every episode that has aired since the vending machine fell, every storyline, every character arc, every guest appearance, every impossible event and unexplained phenomenon, and cascading absurdity that has accumulated across 32 years of subsequent television is a dream. A dream generated by the comatose mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits at his bedside and waits. The evidence is genuinely unsettling when you look at it carefully. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic, exactly. It was always a cartoon, and the heightened reality of animation was always part of its vocabulary. But the storylines dealt with recognizable human problems. Homer tries to control his drinking. Marge wrestles with her sense of self. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and has to navigate the complicated feelings of intellectual admiration and loneliness that come with being the smartest person in your grade. Bart struggles with his academic performance and faces the real possibility of being held back a year. These are everyday family problems told through the lens of satire, but they are rooted in the kinds of situations that real families navigate: financial stress, marital tension, academic struggle, the persistent anxiety of not being good enough at the things you need to be good enough at. The emotional core of the early Simpsons was built on relatability. You watched the family because they felt true, in the way that good satire always feels true, because it exaggerates recognizable reality rather than inventing an unrecognizable one. After the coma, everything changes. The shift is not gradual, it is seismic. Homer goes to space. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers that his mother is a fugitive radical who destroyed a biological weapons lab. Homer meets God. Twice. In different contexts, both times treated as relatively unremarkable. The show goes from a family sitcom grounded in economic anxiety and domestic tension to a show where the main character has met multiple presidents, traveled to dozens of countries, held hundreds of different jobs, befriended and lost celebrity acquaintances with assembly line regularity, and survived physical trauma that would be immediately fatal to any real person. The escalation is so dramatic that even casual fans have noticed the tonal shift. The internet has been debating when The Simpsons got bad, or at least when it got weird, for 20 years. Most of the dates offered cluster in the mid to late 1990s, right around the period when the storylines began. Their drift from grounded family drama toward the increasingly surreal and physically impossible. The coma theory argues that this dating is not a coincidence. The Simpsons did not get bad. Homer's brain got worse. The tonal shift after season 4 is not a creative decision made by writers who lost their compass. It is the natural trajectory of a dreaming mind that is slowly deteriorating. Dreams generated by a damaged brain do not stay coherent. They do not maintain the internal logic of waking experience. They become stranger, more disconnected, more willing to violate the rules of physical reality. The scenarios become more grandiose and less emotionally grounded. The character behaves in ways that serve the dream's emotional needs, rather than the realistic behavioral patterns of a recognizable human being. Homer can go to space in the dream because the dream does not have to obey the physics or the economics of real space travel. Homer can hold hundreds of different jobs because the dream does not need to maintain the continuity of a realistic career trajectory. Homer can survive anything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a hospital bed, only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind cannot kill him, because his mind is the one telling the story. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere episode called Homer the Heretic, Homer has a conversation with God, an actual face-to-face dialogue with the divine. During that conversation, God tells Homer something that the coma theory transforms from a theological gag into something much darker. God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God tells Homer that his time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline is precise. God told Homer, in canonical episode, that his time was nearly up. And 6 months later, in canonical episode, Homer's conscious life ended. The show presents the God conversation as a whimsical theological comedy, and the coma as a plot device that sets up a clip show and then resolves without consequence. But if you read them together, if you allow the first to be a prophecy and the second to be its fulfillment, then the emotional architecture of everything that followed becomes visible. God was telling Homer that his waking life was about to end. And everything that has aired since April of 1993 is the dream of a dying man who is not ready to let go. The coma theory explains the aging problem more elegantly than any other framework available. Nobody in Springfield ages because they exist inside the frozen memory of a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and never came back. Of course, the children do not age. Homer's unconscious mind cannot imagine them growing up because he was not there to see it happen. His wife does not age because the last image his waking brain has of Marge is from the moment before the vending machine fell. His friends do not change because his memory of them is locked at the moment his consciousness ended. The dream preserves his world exactly as it was on the day he lost it, because that is what the mind does under those conditions. It holds the last available image and runs it forward without new information, generating a simulation that stays perpetually close to the remembered reality while becoming progressively less anchored to it as the brain's state deteriorates. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons make sense under this framework as well. Homer's brain, lying in a hospital room, receives ambient input from the world around it. Sounds from the television in the room, voices of visitors at his bedside, music from a radio somewhere in the corridor. the cultural landscape bleeding into his unconscious mind through whatever sensory pathways remain open even in deep coma. His dreaming brain absorbs these fragments and weaves them into the simulation, incorporating names and faces and cultural references from the waking world into the dream world. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield is a voice or a name that Homer heard through the fog of unconsciousness, translated into a dream character by a mind that is trying desperately to keep the story populated and plausible. The show itself has wrestled with this theory. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included a deliberately constructed fake deleted scene in which Homer wakes up from a long coma and reveals that every outlandish episode since the coma was a dream. The scene was promoted as a genuine discovery, a leaked piece of content that revealed the show's true nature. And then the show revealed that the scene was fake, a deliberate hoax. Not a real deleted scene at all, but a constructed piece of misdirection planted to generate buzz. But notice what the hoax required. The writers had to conceive of a plausible version of how the coma reveal would look. They had to write it and animate it and voice it. They had to make it convincing enough to be genuinely mistaken for a real deleted scene. All of which means that at some point, a room full of Simpsons writers sat down and figured out exactly how a Homer wakes from the coma episode would work. They built the thing, in detail, and then they labeled it fake and let it go. Why? Why would the writers invest the time and energy to fully produce a version of the coma reveal and then publicly distance themselves from it? The denial is interesting. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on the show for most of its run, has stated directly that the coma theory is not true. Homer is not in a coma. The show is not a dream. He has been clear about this. But his denials have consistently avoided engaging with the specific evidence the theory presents. He does not explain the tonal shift. He does not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He does not explain the aging freeze or the reset button or the progressive disconnection from physical reality that characterizes the later seasons. He just says it is not true, and the conversation moves on. The theory does not require the writers to have intended it. That is probably the most important thing to understand about the coma theory. It is not an accusation of deliberate deception. The theory is compelling not because the writers secretly embedded it in the show on purpose, but because the show's actual history, the real narrative arc of its creative development, happens to match the trajectory that a coma dream would follow so precisely that the match itself becomes meaningful. A show that was grounded and then became progressively more surreal. A central character who can survive anything. A family that never ages. A world that resets between episodes. A narrative that grows more disconnected from physical reality with every passing season. These are the features of the show as it actually exists. The coma theory just offers an in-universe explanation for all of them simultaneously. And here is the part that stays with you after you have read all the evidence, and weighed all the arguments, and decided what you think about whether Homer is dreaming. The emotional truth of the theory is beautiful regardless of whether the production truth supports it. Homer's deepest wish is simple. He wants his family. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his difficult, infuriating, irreplaceable kid. He wants Lisa to still be playing her saxophone somewhere in the house. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold. He wants Friday nights at the Simpsons house to last forever. That is the whole of it. That is the complete catalog of everything Homer Simpson most deeply wants. The man who can survive anything, endure anything, recover from anything, is ultimately just a man who wants his family to be okay, and his house to be warm, and the beer to be cold, and the people he loves to still be there when he gets home. In the coma, the dream gives him all of it. Every single thing he wants, preserved in amber, running on a loop that never ends. His children never growing up. His wife never leaving. His life never concluding. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. Under the theory, it is the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are always young and the beer is always cold and nobody ever has to say goodbye. And every time Homer survives something impossible, every time the world resets, every time the credits roll, and everything goes back to exactly the way it was, it is not lazy writing. It is not a cheat. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the dream stops, if the simulation finally crashes, then Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed, how old his children really are, whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting by his bed, or worse, not waking up at all. That is the coma theory. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since April of 1993. Every episode you have watched since then is a love letter from an unconscious father to the family he cannot reach. The show will never confirm this, but it will never disprove it either, because the evidence is baked into the structure of the show itself, into 32 years of progressive surrealism and physical impossibility, and the eternal, unchanging, frozen present of Springfield, where the man who went to sleep in a hospital bed in 1993 keeps dreaming the same dream, because the dream is everything he has left. Section 7. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Before you say Maggie, we know the show told us it was Maggie. Season 7, Episode 1, Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 2. Baby did it? Case closed, move on. Except the case was never really closed, not properly. Not in the way a mystery is closed when the evidence leads clearly and inevitably to a single conclusion, and everything we know supports that conclusion, and nothing we know contradicts it. The case was closed in the way that cases sometimes get closed in places like Springfield. Not solved, settled, filed away. Attributed to a suspect who would never face consequences, never be prosecuted, never be able to confirm or deny the accusation in any meaningful way. The case was closed the way Springfield closes all its difficult questions, by choosing the most convenient available answer and making it official. Let us go back to the beginning of the mystery, because the beginning is where the real story lives. Season 6, Episode 25. Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 1. This was the summer of 1995, and The Simpsons pulled off something that had genuinely not been attempted by an animated show before. A real whodunit cliffhanger. A mystery designed with enough care and specificity that the show's creators felt confident inviting the entire American viewing public to participate in a contest to identify the shooter. The winner would be animated into an actual episode. Fox promoted it as a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted, treating the fictional crime as if it were a real, unsolved case worthy of national attention. The premise of the mystery was this. Mr. Burns had finally gone too far. He had stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's budget. He had shut down Moe's Tavern by bankrupting its owner through a series of financial maneuvers that the show depicts with the casual viciousness of someone who does these things so routinely that they no longer notice. He had created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle. He had injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog. And for his grand finale, he had built a massive mechanical disc and used it to block out the sun over the entire town. Not metaphorically. Not as a metaphor for economic exploitation or environmental damage or any of the other things he does metaphorically all the time. He literally stole the sun from Springfield so that the town would be forced to rely on his power plant for all of their electrical needs at all times of day, because there would be no daylight available as an alternative. When Smithers, his most loyal employee and the person most responsible for keeping him alive, objected to this particular plan as a step too far, Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of Part 1, every significant character in Springfield had a documented motive for wanting Burns dead. The show established those motives carefully, over the course of the episode, with enough specificity that several of them felt genuinely compelling. Homer, because Burns had never once learned his name despite Homer working for him for years. Bart and Lisa, because the school lost its funding. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his position when the sinkhole took out the building where he worked. Tito Puente, because Burns eliminated the music program that Puente had been running. Moe, because his bar went under. Smithers, freshly fired, spiraling into despair, the one person who knows Burns' schedule, his vulnerabilities, and the precise location of everything he keeps on his person. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns directly. Multiple people were shown holding weapons. And then Burns was shot with a single bullet and staggered out of the meeting, onto the town sundial, and fell with his hands landing on two letters, W and S. Or, from Burns's perspective, looking up at the dial from below, M and S. The show would later tell us that these letters stood for Maggie Simpson. But before we get to the solution and its problems, let us dwell for a moment in the space of the mystery itself. Because the mystery, as constructed, has a feature that the show acknowledges and then buries. Burns's last words, spoken at the moment of the shooting, were, "Oh, it's you." Not, "Who are you?" Not, "What are you doing?" Not, "Stay back," or any of the language of a person encountering an unexpected threat. He said, "Oh, it's you," the casual, mildly surprised acknowledgement of a person recognizing someone they know, the way you might greet a neighbor you run into unexpectedly at a shop, not alarmed, not frightened, recognizing and acknowledging a familiar face. Burns recognized his shooter. He was not surprised to see them. He had some kind of prior relationship with them, or at minimum some kind of awareness of who they were that made their presence recognizable rather than alarming. Now, does Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Burns barely recognizes Homer, and Homer has worked for him for years, appearing at his place of business regularly, engaging with him directly on multiple occasions, and being the subject of Burns' specific attention during various schemes and plots that the show has depicted across many episodes. Burns routinely fails to remember Homer's name. He refers to him as that and various wrong names. The running gag of Burns' inability to remember Homer's identity is so established and so consistent that it qualifies as a character trait rather than a comedic beat. The idea that Burns would look at a baby with whom he has had no established prior relationship, and say, "Oh, it's you," with the relaxed recognition of greeting an acquaintance, does not match anything the show has established about Burns' relationship with the Simpson family's youngest member. This is the first crack in the official answer. The second is the gun itself. Burns carried a gun in a holster. In the period leading up to the shooting, his holster is shown to be empty. The gun was already missing from his person before the attack occurred. Whoever shot Burns used Burns' own weapon, taken from his holster before the confrontation in the parking lot that the official account describes. This means the shooter was someone who had access to Burns' gun, either someone who took it from him earlier or someone who came across it in an intermediate stage between Burns having it and Burns not having it. The official account says that Burns encountered Maggie in the parking lot, attempted to take her lollipop, and in the resulting struggle, his gun fell from his holster and Maggie picked it up. This is plausible on its face, but it requires Burns' gun to have been in his holster at the moment of the parking lot encounter, and it requires the gun to have become accessible to Maggie through the specific sequence of events described. Neither of these things was directly witnessed by anyone who could confirm them. What we know is that by the time of the shooting, the gun was gone from Burns' holster. The rest is Burns' account, delivered from a hospital bed by a man who had just woken up from being shot, in a state that any defense attorney would immediately challenge as unreliable. The medical literature on memory and trauma is unambiguous. The period surrounding a traumatic injury is one of the least reliable contexts for accurate witness testimony, even when the witness is testifying about events that happened to them directly. The DNA evidence pointed to a Simpson. An eyelash on Burns' suit was identified through forensic analysis as belonging to a member of the Simpson family. The show uses this to implicate Homer, and then pivots to Maggie when Homer's alibi becomes complicated. But the eyelash evidence is interesting for a different reason. It does not tell us which Simpson was present at the shooting. It tells us that a Simpson was present at the shooting. The eyelash belongs to the family, not to an individual member of the family. And there are multiple members of the Simpson family who had documented motives and opportunity. Let us talk about Homer's confession. In season 18, Homer states that he was actually the one who shot Mr. Burns. He says it out loud, on camera. He claims responsibility for the attempted murder of the richest and most powerful man in Springfield. The show treats this as a throwaway line. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Nobody asks Homer to elaborate or challenge his claim, or explain how his account squares with the official verdict that named Maggie as the shooter. Either Homer is lying, which is certainly possible given his character and the show's general comfort with Homer saying things that are not literally true, or Homer is telling the truth and has been living with the knowledge that his infant daughter was publicly blamed for a crime he committed for years and has never done anything to correct the record because the record produced the most convenient possible outcome. Maggie cannot be prosecuted. Homer can. As long as Maggie is the official shooter, Homer is safe. If Homer did it, the evidence reads differently. The eyelash belongs to a Simpson, consistent with Homer. Homer had the clearest established motive. The humiliation of years of working for a man who could not be bothered to learn his name had finally accumulated to a breaking point. Homer's physical and emotional state on the night of the shooting was documented to be volatile. And Homer, standing in a public meeting with a room full of armed people, in the chaos of confronting Burns, might have been the one person in the room who did not bring his own weapon. He found Burns's gun on the ground, or took it from Burns's holster in the chaos of the crowd, and in a moment of impulsive rage did the thing that the entire town had been collectively too afraid or too rational to do, which would explain Burns's parting words perfectly. "Oh, it's you!" Burns recognized Homer. Burns sees Homer regularly. Homer works for him. Burns might not remember Homer's name, but he would recognize his face. "You, it's you, the man from Sector 7G. The safety inspector who cannot operate the equipment he is supposed to inspect." Burns recognizing Homer is consistent with everything the show has established. Then there is the Marge theory. A reading of the shooting that surfaces periodically in fan analysis proposes that the real shooter was Marge Simpson. The case has surprising strength. Marge watched Burns destroy her children's school, injure her family's dog, and steal the son from the town where she is raising her family. She had every reason in the world to want Burns stopped. And the show has previously established that Burns developed a romantic fixation on Marge during the period she was briefly employed at the plant. If Burns retained any element of that fixation, if some part of him still felt something for Marge even after she had returned to her marriage, then his decision to protect the real shooter becomes emotionally coherent. He woke up, he remembered who had shot him, and rather than name Marge as the person responsible, he allowed the investigation to proceed without his real testimony, and when pressed for an answer, he gestured at the sundial and let the letters do the talking. He took the bullet. He accepted the reduction of his power that comes with surviving an assassination attempt in a town that knows someone tried to kill you. And in exchange, the woman he could not stop thinking about walked away without consequences. This reading also makes sense of Maggie as the fall guy. Chief Wiggum's comment that no jury in the world would convict a baby is not just a punchline. It is a statement of fact about the investigation's outcome. Whoever was actually responsible for the shooting, whether it was Homer or Marge or someone else entirely, having a baby take the official blame produced the cleanest possible result. The case is closed. Nobody goes to prison, the investigation ends, and the actual shooter continues living their life in Springfield, with the knowledge that the one person in town powerful enough to punish them chose not to, for reasons that were never fully explained. The contest that accompanied the episode is itself damning evidence for the theory that the official answer does not fully hold up. Fox invited the American public to submit their guess for who shot Burns. The winner, they promised, would be animated into a future episode. Thousands of entries were submitted, and according to the DVD commentary for the episodes, not a single person from the randomly selected sample of entries identified the correct answer. Nobody guessed Maggie. The person who received the prize was chosen randomly from the pool. They did not have the right answer. They received a cash payment instead of the promised animated appearance because the animated appearance was contingent on getting it right, and nobody got it right. The writers acknowledge on the commentary that they were aware of one person who posted the correct answer to an online forum on the night of the original broadcast, but by the time the contest ended and producers tried to trace this person, the account they had used was no longer active. The one person who identified Maggie as the shooter before the reveal could not be found. Think about what the contest's failure actually tells you. The show's creators designed a mystery and told the public it was solvable from the clues in Part 1. They promoted a national contest around that claim, and when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had solved it. The clues were either insufficient, or the red herrings were so effective that they overwhelmed the genuine evidence, or the answer did not follow as naturally and inevitably from the available evidence as the show implied. The alternate endings, fully produced, fully voiced, tell the same story. A complete version of the resolution in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter was animated, not as a rough storyboard or a concept sketch, but as a full production with completed dialogue and finished character animation. This ending was shown in a clip show episode, where it is dismissed as a version that would have required ignoring the Simpson DNA evidence, which the presenter calls downright nutty. And in the same breath, he compares that act of ignoring DNA evidence to the thing that happened in a famous real-world trial of the mid-1990s. The show is winking. It is telling you that ignoring evidence is something that happens, that official verdicts are not always determined by what the evidence actually shows, that the person with the most power to shape the outcome of an investigation is not always the detective. The case was closed. In Springfield, that is not the same thing as solved. And the greatest mystery in the show's history remains, 30 years later, exactly as open as it was on the night Burns staggered onto the sundial and looked up at the sky. He said, "Oh, it's you." He knew who did it. He always knew. And he chose to let a baby take the blame, which means the real question was never who pulled the trigger. The real question is, what did Burns know about the shooter that made protecting them worth more than justice? That is the question Springfield has never asked. And Springfield never will. Number Section 8. Mona Simpson and the Hidden War. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told him that his mother passed away when Homer was young. There was a grave. Homer mourned, in the way Homer mourns things, which is to say deeply and briefly, and with a pain that he does not have the vocabulary to fully process or articulate. He grew up believing he was a boy whose mother died. He built his entire emotional architecture around that belief. The longing for a mother he had lost shaped the way he loved Marge, the way he needed his children, the way he related to authority figures, the way he navigated his own profound need for approval, and his profound fear of abandonment. Homer Simpson's entire personality, the neediness, the clinginess, the desperate desire to be liked, the willingness to endure humiliation rather than risk losing the stability of his family, the terror at the edges of his seemingly simple emotional life, all of it is the architecture of a child who grew up believing his mother chose to leave the world rather than stay with him. In Season 7, the show revealed that the belief was false. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November of 1995, and it is widely considered one of the finest episodes the series has ever produced. Homer discovers that his mother is alive. Not recently alive. Alive this whole time. The grave that Abe showed him as a child did not contain his mother. It contained Walt Whitman, the poet, and Abe Simpson had been directing his son to grieve at a famous writer's headstone for Homer's entire life. The deception is so specific, so deliberate, so sustained across decades, that it cannot be explained by confusion or misremembering. Abe knew his wife was alive. Abe knew Homer did not know, and Abe maintained that lie for 27 years. The reason, when it finally comes out, is both more complicated and more political than anything Homer is fully equipped to process. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving Homer. She left because she was a fugitive. She had made an enemy so powerful and so vindictive that staying in Springfield would have put her son and her husband at risk. And the enemy she had made was Charles Montgomery Burns. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. She was, by all the evidence the show provides, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life in Springfield, while the world outside was burning through some of its most turbulent years. The civil rights movement, the counterculture, the protests against Vietnam, the sense, shared by a significant portion of the American population at the time, that the institutions of society needed to be challenged and reformed, and in some cases dismantled entirely. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists, and they targeted a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let us pause here, not for dramatic effect, but because this detail deserves more attention than it typically receives. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant, he owned a germ warfare facility, a laboratory designed to produce biological weapons, housed in the same town where Homer Simpson was growing up, where families were living their daily lives, where children were going to school in the building next to the nuclear plant that was already at some level of operations that predated even its own documented history of violations, beginning to contaminate the surrounding environment. Burns was manufacturing weapons-grade biological agents in Springfield, the same town whose primary environmental hazard is its nuclear facility, the same town whose water supply has been contaminated by radioactive runoff, the same town whose residents display biological anomalies consistent with decades of chronic environmental contamination. That same town also had, at some point in the 1960s, a secret biological weapons program operated by its primary employer and most powerful resident. Springfield is not just an accidentally contaminated town. Springfield is a place where the most destructive technologies ever developed by human beings have been concentrated in the hands of a single private individual who has used that concentration not for any civic purpose but for the accumulation and protection of his own power. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They destroyed the biological agents stored inside. They succeeded. And then Mona made the mistake that defined the rest of her life. As the group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos of the raid. That someone was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns looked at her face. He identified her. He called the authorities. From that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not hold her son or explain to him why she was leaving. She kissed a sleeping Homer goodbye and disappeared into a life underground that would last for 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 3 decades believing he was the kind of son a mother would rather leave than stay with. Not because she died, because she left. Even with the death framing softening it, the emotional wound was always that she was gone and he was here, and he had not been enough reason for her to stay. That belief shaped everything. Now consider what the revelation of Mona's survival adds to the architecture of the Burns conspiracy. Burns did not just identify Mona to the FBI in 1969. He pursued her actively, continuously for decades. When Mona finally comes back to Springfield in Season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a cab window across a street after 27 years, and he calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer watches his mother leave for the second time. Burns has been carrying a personal grudge against a woman who destroyed his germ warfare facility for 27 years. He has been watching for her. His resources, his connections, his access to information about fugitives and their movements, he has kept all of it trained on the possibility that Mona Simpson might resurface. And when she does, he acts within what appears to be hours. This is not the behavior of a man who forgot about a minor irritant from 3 decades ago. This is the behavior of a man for whom the destruction of his biological weapons program represents an unforgivable offense, and for whom the person responsible represents a continued threat that must be monitored and contained. Which raises a question that the show never explicitly asks, but that the Mona storyline implicitly poses. What else was in that lab? Mona's group destroyed the biological agents that were stored there at the time of the raid. But was that all? A facility of that kind, operated in secret by a man of Burns's resources and apparent lack of ethical constraint, could have housed any number of research programs. The show identifies the specific biological weapon that was destroyed, but it does not suggest that the raid eliminated everything Burns was doing in that facility. The facility itself presumably continued to operate in some form afterward, or was replaced by successor programs elsewhere in Burns's extensive private infrastructure. Burns's reaction to Mona's presence, the sustained vigilance across decades, the immediate mobilization of federal resources when she reappears, suggests that she represents more than just an embarrassing episode of property damage from his distant past. She represents someone who knows something, someone who was inside his operation, someone who could, if she chose to speak publicly and could be believed, reveal details about what Burns was doing in Springfield in the 1960s that would be of significant interest to regulatory and law enforcement agencies. Burns needed her gone. Not just away from Springfield. Gone. Underground. In a state where speaking publicly was not an option because she was a fugitive, and anything she said could be dismissed as the claims of a criminal. He did not just ruin her life. He designed the ruin carefully. He put her in a position where the truth she carried was neutralized by her legal status. She could not come forward because coming forward meant arrest. And so the truth she carried, whatever the full truth about Burns's biological weapons program was, stayed buried with her. Now, bring Homer into this, because Homer is the connective tissue between everything. Homer works for Burns. Homer has worked for Burns his entire adult life. Homer has worked for the man who destroyed his family for decades without connecting those two facts in any sustained or meaningful way. He knows, at the level of explicit information, that Burns was responsible for his mother's exile. The show establishes this clearly. When Mona tells her story, Burns is identified as the person who reported her to the FBI. Homer knows. But knowing, for Homer, does not produce the response that knowing would produce in a person with fully functional cognitive capacity. He does not quit. He does not confront Burns. He does not even seem to sustain a lasting anger about the connection between his employer and his mother's absence. By the next episode, Homer is back at work in Sector 7G, eating donuts, sleeping at his console, letting the vending machine berate him. This is not indifference. It is damage. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of cognitive erosion have robbed Homer of the capacity to hold this kind of complex temporal connection in mind long enough to act on it. He knows in the moment of knowing that Burns took his mother, but the knowledge does not stick the way knowledge sticks in a healthy mind. It fades. It blurs. It gets absorbed into the fog of daily life. And the next morning, Homer needs to go to work, and work is at the power plant. And the power plant is Burns's, and there is nothing Homer can do about any of it, because Homer cannot hold the architecture of his own situation in mind for long enough to see what it would require him to do. Burns did not just take Homer's mother. He engineered the conditions that would ensure Homer could never do anything about it. By driving Mona underground when Homer was 6 years old, Burns guaranteed that Homer would spend his formative years developing the specific pattern of emotional damage that would make him the perfect employee, desperate for approval, terrified of abandonment, clinging to whatever stability his job and his family provided, unable to risk the loss of either by challenging the man responsible for his suffering, because challenging Burns would mean confronting the possibility of losing the job that represents the one stable external structure in his life. Homer is not at the power plant because he lacks the intelligence to find better employment. Homer is at the power plant because Burns designed the conditions of Homer's emotional and psychological development to ensure he would be there. The broken child became the compliant adult became the perfect safety inspector, in the sense that a perfect safety inspector for Burns's purposes is one who never actually inspects anything. And then the deal between Burns and Abe Simpson adds another layer. It comes out eventually that Burns had committed some offense that Abe discovered. The show is deliberately vague about the nature of this offense, but the arrangement it produced is not vague at all. Burns guaranteed Homer a permanent position at the plant in exchange for Abe's silence. Homer would never be fired. No matter how many errors he accumulated, no matter how incompetent his performance, no matter how many documented violations occurred on his watch, Homer's job would be protected. This deal was made between Abe Simpson and Burns, without Homer's knowledge or consent, in exchange for Abe's agreement not to reveal whatever it was that Burns had done. Homer's job security, the thing he experiences as the one stable anchor of his adult life, the thing that allows him to maintain his family and his home and the routines that give his damaged mind its daily structure, is not the result of Homer's work or Homer's value to the organization. It is a contractual obligation between his father and his mother's persecutor. It was arranged in silence, maintained in silence, and never explained to Homer because explaining it would require explaining everything else. Homer spends his life working for the man who took his mother, protected from the consequences of his own incompetence by a deal arranged by the father who lied to him about his mother's death, inside a facility that poisons the water he drinks and the air he breathes, accumulating cognitive damage that ensures he can never quite see the full picture of what has been done to him. 3 generations of Simpsons, broken by one man's grudge and one man's power. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the devil and buried the truth. Homer inherited the consequences and has never understood why his life feels so heavy. When Mona finally died, in a later episode, the scene is one of the most quietly devastating things the show has ever produced. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away for the last time. No joke. No cutaway. No reset. Just a man and his mother and the weight of 27 stolen years pressing down on both of them in a hospital room that smells like all the years that should have been different. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath all the jokes and the gags and the falling down and the getting up and the strangling and the screaming and the donuts, there is a story about a family that was systematically dismantled by one man's power and one town's inability to resist it. And Mona Simpson is where that story lives at its most honest. She fought for something real. She paid a price that was real, and the man she fought against is still there, still running the plant, still keeping the violations unfixed, still signing the checks that Homer cashes to buy the food that sustains the family in the house, that runs on electricity from the reactor that leaked the radiation, that damaged the brain, that cannot remember that any of this is connected. Burns always wins. In Springfield, the man with the money writes the history, and the history says Mona Simpson was a dangerous radical who had to be contained. It does not say what she was actually doing in that laboratory. It does not say what she destroyed and what she saved. It does not say what Springfield might have been if the biological weapons program had continued and what Springfield would look like now if it had. History in Springfield is what Burns allows it to be. Everything else gets buried, and the people doing the burying convince themselves it was necessary. Because confronting the truth of what Burns did to the Simpsons across 3 generations would require confronting the truth of what he has done to Springfield across the same period. And Springfield does not do that. Springfield forgets. Number. Section 9. The Prediction Phenomenon. The Simpsons predicted Donald Trump's presidency 16 years before it happened. That sentence, or some version of it, has been shared on social media millions of times since the 2016 election. The episode it references, Bart to the Future from the year 2000, depicted a future version of America in which Lisa Simpson has just been elected the first female president. Her predecessor in the Oval Office is identified as Donald Trump, and the episode treats this fact as a joke, a shorthand for a national trajectory towards celebrity politics and spectacle over substance. The episode aired in March of the year 2000. Trump won the presidency in November of 2016. 16 years separated the joke from the reality. The internet responded with a mixture of amazement and unease. People who had not watched the show in years were suddenly sharing screenshots and asking how the writers could possibly have known. The clip went viral in a way that elevated a mid-tier Simpsons episode to genuine cultural phenomenon status. The Simpsons predicted Trump became not just a fan theory but a legitimate topic of mainstream conversation, covered by news organizations and discussed by people who had no particular investment in the show's ongoing mythology. And the Trump prediction is just the most famous example. The list of apparent predictions runs much longer. In a 1995 episode, the show depicted a device worn on the wrist that could receive video calls and messages, something that looks remarkably like a modern smartwatch. In a 1994 episode, Homer goes to space with a famous real-world astronaut, decades before private space tourism became a commercially viable industry. In a 1998 episode, Homer encounters a mathematical equation that appears to anticipate the theoretical mass of the Higgs boson particle, a subatomic particle that would not be experimentally confirmed until 2012. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes that the universe might be shaped like a donut, and years later, cosmologists identified radiation patterns that suggested the universe might indeed have a toroidal topology. In a 1993 episode called Margin Chains, a flu virus originating in Asia spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, panic buying, and a frantic communal search for a vaccine. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic began. And during the chaos of that fictional outbreak, the town accidentally released a swarm of killer bees, which felt bizarrely prophetic when Asian giant hornets, dubbed murder hornets by the media, showed up in North America during the actual pandemic of 2020. In 1996, an episode called Homer Palooza featured a joke where a hip-hop group accidentally books the London Symphony Orchestra. That specific collaboration actually happened in 2024, 28 years after the joke, when the group in question performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. A 1998 episode depicted Disney acquiring a major entertainment conglomerate, and in 2019, Disney acquired the company that had distributed The Simpsons for its entire run. The show's own distributor was absorbed by a corporation the show had satirized as a world-consuming entertainment behemoth 20 years earlier. Across multiple episodes, across multiple seasons, the show depicted video calling technology before it existed in widespread consumer form. It depicted autocorrect failures before autocorrect existed. It depicted surveillance culture as a normalized feature of daily life before that normalization fully occurred. It depicted the aesthetics and social dynamics of social media before social media, as the phenomenon we know now, existed. The list generates its own momentum. Every new episode that airs, every cultural event that bears even a passing resemblance to a previous Simpsons storyline, produces a new round of screenshot sharing and breathless commentary about the show's apparent prophetic quality. And the question that accompanies every new entry on the list is always the same. How do they know? The official answer, delivered by the people who actually make the show, is disarmingly simple. Al Jean, who has run the show as executive producer for most of its run, has addressed the prediction phenomenon directly on multiple occasions. His explanation reduces to a fundamental principle of probability. If you throw enough darts, you will hit some bullseyes. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, observations, satirical points, and comedic extrapolations of current events and trends. When you generate that volume of content over that span of time, some portion of it will, through sheer statistical probability, eventually align with something that actually happens. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, has been even more specific about the mechanism. Most of what gets called a prediction, he has explained, is not prediction at all. It is observation. The writers are not forecasting the future. They are reading the present with unusually careful attention and then pushing it forward a few logical steps. When they depicted a Trump presidency in the year 2000, they were not predicting an improbable future event. They were observing that Trump had been publicly flirting with running for office since the late 1980s, that celebrity culture was becoming increasingly intertwined with political culture, and that the logical extension of those visible trends was a political landscape in which celebrity status had become sufficient qualification for the highest office. The joke was not a forecast. It was a diagnosis of a trajectory that was already visible in the cultural data available to anyone paying close attention. The Disney acquisition worked the same way. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend visible to anyone following the entertainment industry in the late 1990s. The direction of travel was clear. The destination was foreseeable. The writers did not need to predict the future to write that joke. They needed to read the present accurately and push it to its obvious conclusion. The same applies to the smartwatch, to the surveillance culture commentary, to the video calling technology, to most of the predictions on the list. The writers of The Simpsons have, throughout the show's history, included a disproportionate number of people with graduate-level training in mathematics, computer science, political science, and the physical sciences. These are not people pulling random guesses out of thin air. They are highly educated observers of American culture and technology who spend their careers studying patterns, analyzing trajectories, and extrapolating current conditions toward their most absurd but plausible conclusions. They are not predicting the future. They are reading the present more carefully than most people do, and then writing down what the present already implies about where things are headed. There is also the mechanism of confirmation bias to account for, and it is perhaps the most important factor in the prediction phenomenon. The Simpsons has produced thousands of satirical observations about American culture, technology, politics, and social behavior across its 800 episodes. Many of those observations were simply wrong. They depicted futures and outcomes and cultural developments that did not happen. Jetpacks never arrived. Certain predicted political outcomes went the other way. Cultural shifts that the show anticipated simply did not materialize in the form the show imagined. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of jokes about the future have simply not come true. Nobody remembers those. Nobody screenshots them. Nobody shares them on social media as evidence of the show's prophetic failures. The misses are invisible, not because they did not happen, but because they do not produce the emotional response that drives viral sharing. You do not repost a Simpsons clip from 1997 because it depicts a future that turned out to be completely wrong. You repost the clips that landed, the ones that feel spooky, because the gap between the joke and the reality collapsed in an unexpected way. Confirmation bias is one of the most powerful and most comprehensively documented cognitive phenomena in the psychology literature. We remember the evidence that supports what we find surprising or meaningful, and we discount or forget the evidence that contradicts it. Apply this to a show with nearly 800 episodes and thousands of individual satirical observations. Filter those observations through 36 years of cultural change and select only the ones that seem to have come true. And what you get is not evidence of prophecy. What you get is a curated highlight reel of the inevitable coincidences produced by extraordinary volume run through a selection mechanism that only preserves the hits. All of this is true. All of this is a legitimate and accurate description of how the prediction phenomenon works at the level of statistical probability and cognitive bias. And yet, some of the predictions are specific enough that probability and bias feel like insufficient explanations, and this is where the meta-theory that the transcript gestures toward comes into its own. The Trump prediction did not just forecast that a celebrity might run for president, it identified Donald Trump by name. And an image from the episode depicts the character descending an escalator in a sequence that, when placed beside the footage of Trump's actual campaign announcement in 2015, produces a visual correspondence that is striking enough to be genuinely strange. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just make a joke about dangerous exotic animals. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers in a scene that mirrors what actually happened in 2003 with specific enough fidelity that it produces real cognitive dissonance. These are not vague trend extrapolations. These are specific details that align with future events in ways that the probability explanation struggles to fully account for. The meta-theory that addresses this most interestingly does not require the writers to be prophets or time travelers or any other impossible thing. It requires something simpler and in some ways more unsettling. The Simpsons does not predict the future. It shapes it. Not through magic. Through cultural influence of a kind and scale that very few creative works in the history of television have ever achieved. The Simpsons has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have become part of the American cultural lexicon in the deepest possible way. Its observations have shaped how Americans talk about their own culture, their own politics, their own institutions. When the show makes a joke about Trump becoming president in the year 2000, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. It is watched by millions of people. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people recall when they see Trump at his various attempts at political relevance over the following 16 years. It primes the cultural imagination. It makes the idea of a Trump presidency feel not like a shocking impossibility, but like an inevitable punchline. It makes it feel familiar before it has happened. And when the punchline finally arrives, when reality catches up to the joke, it does not feel like a prediction coming true. It feels like recognition. We have seen this. The Simpsons did this already. The cultural preparation the show provided made the outcome feel like something the collective imagination had already processed. And that collective processing may itself have contributed to the cultural conditions that made the outcome more likely. This is not a fringe theory. It is a documented phenomenon in the study of cultural influence. Fiction shapes reality not just by predicting it, but by normalizing it. By making certain kinds of futures feel familiar and therefore plausible and therefore achievable. By pre-populating the cultural imagination with images and ideas that give real people frameworks for understanding what they are seeing when those images and ideas start showing up outside of fiction. Springfield does not reflect America. America has spent 36 years becoming Springfield. The show held up a mirror and the country stared into it for so long that it started to resemble what it saw. The nuclear power plant? The corrupt billionaire who can do whatever he wants without meaningful consequences? The government that cannot effectively challenge concentrated private power? The population too distracted and too divided to sustain the collective action that might actually produce change? The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset and starting fresh as if nothing happened. Springfield was not a prediction of where America was headed. It was a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first. And here is the final dimension of the prediction phenomenon that makes it genuinely interesting, rather than just statistically explicable. The predictions that feel most uncanny are not the ones that seem most random. They are the ones that feel like the logical conclusion of something that was already in motion. The Trump prediction works because anyone paying careful attention in the year 2000 could see that the conditions for it were already present. The Disney acquisition works because anyone watching media consolidation trends in the late 90s could see where they were pointing. The Higgs boson equation works because the show's writers included someone with genuine mathematical training who was working from real theoretical physics. The predictions are not supernatural. They are the natural output of brilliant, well-educated minds engaging deeply with the present and being willing to follow its implications wherever they led, no matter how absurd the destination appeared from the vantage point of the moment. And then time passed, and the absurd destinations kept arriving, and each one felt like the show had known something it should not have known. When the reality is simpler and more interesting, the show knew exactly what it knew, and it turned out that what it knew was enough to see further than most. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American life, and enough bullseyes to make the writers themselves pause occasionally and wonder if maybe, just maybe, they understand something about the shape of things that most people are not equipped to see as clearly. Not prophecy, just attention. Sustained, specific, unsparing attention paid to a country that was always more Springfield than it wanted to admit. Number, Section 10. Springfield's Collective Amnesia. On September 28, 1997, Season 9, Episode 2 of The Simpsons aired. It was called The Principal and the Pauper, and the backlash was immediate. Harry Shearer, who voices Principal Skinner and Mr. Burns and several other characters, publicly criticized the episode. Fans wrote angry letters. Critics used the episode as a reference point in debates about when the show had started to lose its way. 28 years later, it is still regularly cited as the episode that broke the audience's trust. The episode that proved the writers would do anything, no matter how destructive to the show's continuity, in service of a premise they found interesting. The fans have been reading the episode wrong this entire time. Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the ceremony, a stranger walks in. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War, who was believed to have been killed after being captured as a prisoner of war. He survived. He escaped. And he came back to Springfield to discover that someone else had been living his life for 2 decades. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a petty criminal from a broken background with no prospects and no identity worth claiming. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news to Skinner's mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a home or a family or a name that meant something, went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the identity, the rank, the life, the mother, and he lived inside that theft for 20 years. The town learns the truth. The real Skinner is present. The evidence is unambiguous. Everyone in Springfield knows that their principal is a fraud. And then Springfield does something extraordinary. They hold a vote, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on whether to restore the real Skinner's identity and give him the recognition he is owed. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. Springfield chooses to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree establishing that the imposter is, officially, the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the veteran who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his identity stolen, is physically removed from Springfield. He is tied to a railroad car, taken out of town, and the judge makes it explicitly illegal to ever mention any of this again, under penalty of unspecified but clearly significant punishment. Fans were furious. The episode destroyed Skinner's character, they said. Everything we knew about him was built on a fiction. His military service, his relationship with Agnes, his dynamic with Bart, his entire personality. All of it a performance layered over a stolen identity. The show had discarded its own continuity for the sake of a premise that did not respect the audience's investment in the characters. But here is what the fans, in their fury over the continuity violation, mostly missed. The episode is not about Skinner. The episode is about Springfield. And specifically, it is about the mechanism that Springfield uses to maintain the reality it prefers over the reality it actually inhabits. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. It has always agreed to forget whatever does not fit the preferred narrative. The episode called The Principal and the Pauper is not the moment the show betrayed this principle. It is the only episode where the show made the mechanism visible, where it let you watch the vote happen in real time, where it showed you the legal infrastructure of denial, the formal process by which a community decides that the truth is less important than the stability of its comfortable fictions. Every other time Springfield forgets a catastrophe, or ignores a contradiction, or resets to normal after an event that should permanently alter the town's reality, the forgetting happens off-screen. Between episodes, in the invisible gap between the credits rolling and the next episode beginning, You never see the meeting where the town collectively decided not to acknowledge what happened. You never see the decree. You never see the expulsion of the inconvenient truth-teller. The Principal and the Pauper is the one time the show lets you watch all of that happen explicitly, in the frame, with dialogue and character reactions and a legal procedure that gives the denial the weight of official sanction. This is not bad writing. This is the most honest thing the show ever did about its own nature. Consider the scale of what Springfield has forgotten across 36 years of episodes. The town has been physically sealed under a massive government-imposed dome. By the next episode, no one mentions it. The sun was blocked by a mechanical disc operated by their employer. The sky went dark over the entire town. By the following week, the sun is back, and nobody references the period of enforced darkness, or discusses how or whether it affected the ecosystem, or examines the legal implications of a private citizen blocking a town's access to sunlight. A nuclear near-miss at the power plant. A town-destroying sinkhole. Multiple visits from extraterrestrial or apparently extraterrestrial beings. Homer's repeated deaths, literal legal deaths in at least one episode, followed by seamless resurrection without explanation or comment. The list of things Springfield has forgotten is longer than the list of things it remembers. The slate gets wiped between episodes with a completeness that feels supernatural. No residue, no scarring, no collective trauma that persists into the following week. The town resets. Fans have explanations for this. The coma theory. It is a dream and dreams reset without continuity by nature. The radiation theory. The cognitive damage from chronic contamination has compromised the town's collective memory function in the same way it has compromised individual neurological function. The floating timeline. It is just how episodic television works, and we should not expect continuity from a format that was designed around self-contained narratives. But The Principal and the Pauper offers a fourth explanation that is both more mundane and more disturbing than any of the others. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset, collectively, deliberately, through a social contract that is never quite stated explicitly, but is deeply understood by everyone who participates in it. We will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality. We will treat the lie as truth. We will treat the truth as a criminal matter. And anyone who breaks this contract, anyone who insists on the inconvenient reality instead of the comfortable fiction, will be removed from the community. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. A man who arrived with proof that the official narrative was false. A man whose very presence was an argument for paying attention to what is actually true rather than what is comfortable to believe. And Springfield's response was to tie him to a railroad car and expel him from the jurisdiction. That is the template, not just for the Skinner situation, for everything. The three-eyed fish is Springfield's canary in the coal mine too. It is proof, tangible and visible and scientifically significant, that the nuclear plant is doing exactly what critics have always said it was doing. And Springfield's response was to watch Burns eat the fish on television and conclude that the problem had been addressed. The evidence was displayed, processed, and dismissed. The canary was put back in its cage. The human skeletons in the basement of the nuclear plant are Springfield's canary. The crayon in Homer's skull is Springfield's canary. The fact that Burns is apparently well over 100 years old and nobody asks the obvious question is Springfield's canary. Maggie's extraordinary capabilities are Springfield's canary. The fact that every resident of the town is yellow and has 4 fingers is Springfield's canary. Every anomaly, every impossibility, every piece of evidence that the agreed-upon reality of Springfield is a fiction layered over a much stranger and more troubling truth, every single one of those things is a canary. And Springfield's response to each of them is the same. It votes to ignore it. It decrees the anomaly away. It expels anyone who insists on talking about it. The town's amnesia is not a glitch. It is a feature. It is the most important feature of Springfield's social architecture, because without it, the entire edifice collapses. If the town remembered the dome, it would have to acknowledge the contamination. If it acknowledged the contamination, it would have to confront the plant. If it confronted the plant, it would have to challenge Burns. If it challenged Burns, the economy that depends on him might collapse. If the economy collapsed, the town might die, and so the town forgets. Not because it cannot remember, but because remembering is too expensive. The cost of memory, in Springfield, is the cost of action. And action, real, sustained systemic action against the root causes of Springfield's accumulated dysfunction, is something that the town's collective cognitive state, impaired by decades of environmental contamination, never quite achieves the activation energy to produce. The Principal and the Pauper makes all of this explicit through the Skinner storyline, because identity theft is a more emotionally legible form of the same crime that Burns has been committing against Springfield for decades. Burns stole Springfield's health. He stole its water and its air and its children's neurological development. He stole Mona Simpson from Homer and Homer's potential from Homer and 3 generations of the Simpson family from the future they might have had. He has been stealing from Springfield continuously since before most of its current residents were born. And Springfield's response, in every case, has been to vote to maintain the fiction that everything is fine, that the fish with 3 eyes is an isolated curiosity, that the plant's violations are administrative matters, that Burns is just an eccentric old employer rather than the architect of the town's accumulated suffering. Springfield has always chosen Armin Tamzarian over the real Seymour Skinner. It has always chosen the comfortable fiction over the disruptive truth. The episode just gave that preference a name and a legal procedure and a railroad car. If you accept the coma theory framework, the Principal and the Pauper episode takes on an even more specific and more devastating meaning. If Homer has been dreaming since 1993, if everything since the vending machine fell is the product of a sleeping mind, then this episode is Homer's unconscious mind dreaming about the nature of its own condition. It is Homer's sleeping brain, at some deep level of awareness below the level of the dream's narrative, generating a storyline that is essentially about itself. Homer's coma is an Armin Tamzarian situation, a fake life, plausibly constructed, replacing a real one. A performance of ongoing existence covering an actual cessation of conscious experience. A town that chooses to maintain the fiction because the alternative, acknowledging the truth of what has happened, is too shattering to bear. If the coma theory is correct, then the episode where Springfield votes to sustain a lie rather than acknowledge a truth is Homer's unconscious mind showing you the mechanism by which it sustains its own lie. The lie that he is awake. The lie that the dream is real. The lie that his family is still accessible, still young, still present in the way they were before the vending machine fell. Homer's sleeping brain voted to maintain the fiction. It decreed that the dream was real. It expelled the possibility of waking up, and every episode since, every reset, every impossible survival, every morning in Springfield that looks just like the morning before, is the enforcement of that decree. The real Seymour Skinner, the truth that would end the dream, is still out there, tied to a railroad car, moving away from Springfield at the speed the dream requires. And in Springfield, at the intersection of all the theories, at the place where the floating timeline and the nuclear conspiracy and the coma dream and the collective denial all converge, the same vote keeps getting cast. Keep the lie. Expel the truth. The morning after, everything will be back to normal. Homer will go to work. Bart will be 10. Lisa will be 8. Maggie will be watching. Marge will be patient. The cooling towers will be cracked. The fish will have 3 eyes. Burns will remember the Spanish-American War and nobody will find this strange. And the show will continue, as it has always continued, because Springfield has voted to continue it. Because we, watching, have voted to continue it. Because the loop that started in 1989 is maintained not by the writers or by the characters, but by the audience that returns every week to make sure the family is still there and the house is still standing, and the timeline is still floating. The real mystery of The Simpsons is not who shot Mr. Burns, or where Springfield is located, or how Burns stays alive, or why nobody ages, or what Maggie is planning. Those are all real mysteries with real evidence, and real competing theories that illuminate the show from different angles and make it more interesting than it would be without them. The real mystery is simpler and harder. Why do we keep watching? Not in the superficial sense. Not the surface-level explanation about comfort and habit and nostalgia and the reliable pleasure of a familiar format. The deeper version, the version that the theories, collectively, are actually asking. Why do we need this? Why has the American television audience watched the same family, in the same house, in the same impossible town for 36 years, when the entire premise of storytelling is that characters grow and change and eventually reach some kind of conclusion? Why have we collectively, continuously, voted to keep the timeline floating and the family frozen and the story running. What are we protecting by protecting Springfield? Maybe it is the version of American domestic life that Springfield represents. Chaotic and warm and deeply flawed and irreplaceable. The family that survives everything. The town that forgets everything. The show that resets every week and begins again. Because beginning again is the one thing it will always be able to do. Maybe it is simpler than that. Maybe we keep watching because letting go of Springfield means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older now. That the couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits no longer exists in the way it existed then, and the people we watched it with have changed or moved or left us. And as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8, and Homer is stumbling through the door at 5:30, and the couch gag plays and the family assembles, we do not have to admit any of that. We can go home to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes in the town that never ages in the show that never ends. And maybe that is the only answer any of these theories were ever really after. Not why the fish have 3 eyes or how Burns stays alive or where the town is on a map, but why the loop keeps running. Why we keep pressing play. Why the vote to maintain the fiction keeps passing, every week, by unanimous decision. In the most comprehensively theorized, most deeply analyzed, most lovingly examined 36-year television experiment in the history of the medium. Because the truth would end it. And we are not ready for it to end. Because the loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week to make sure the walls are still standing. And every time we watch, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before most of us were born, we tighten the loop a little more. The Simpsons are trapped in Springfield because we trapped them there. And we trap them there because home, even a home that poisons you, even a home built on lies and radiation and collective denial and the engineered stupidity of a man in a coma who refuses to stop dreaming, is still home. And home is the only heaven any of us would ever think to ask for. Number. Section 2. Extended. The Burns Immortality Machine. The Deeper History. Let us return to Burns, because the surface of the immortality question has barely been scratched. There is a moment in the show's history that most people remember as a throwaway gag, a quick visual joke that gets a laugh and is immediately forgotten. It occurs in one of the early seasons when the camera briefly rests on Burns's office walls, and you can see, among the various artifacts and decorations, a collection of photographs, historical photographs, black and white, sepia-toned, the kind that suggests significant age, and Burns appears in several of them. Not a distant ancestor who happens to share his features. Burns himself recognizable in the contexts and fashions of different historical periods. The show does not linger on this. It does not turn to the audience and say, "Look at this. Think about what this means." It shows you the evidence and moves on, trusting that the details accumulate in the viewer's consciousness even when the narrative does not acknowledge them directly. Those photographs, taken with the level of seriousness that the radiation theory demands, are not decoration. They are a timeline. They are evidence of a presence that extends further back than the already extraordinary claimed lifespan of 130-plus years that most readings of Burns's backstory suggest. They imply a continuity that predates not just the current generation but the generation before it and possibly the generation before that. How far back does Burns actually go? The show has given us enough material to construct a partial answer, though the answer it constructs raises more questions than it resolves. Burns's family wealth, as established across various episodes, predates the Industrial Revolution. His family did not build its fortune through the new economic opportunities that the 19th century created. His family had already accumulated significant power and resources before those opportunities existed. They were the kind of wealthy that shapes the conditions in which other people accumulate wealth. The kind that builds the infrastructure and then charges everyone else for access to it. This is a very specific kind of wealth. It is generational not just in the sense of being passed from parent to child, but in the sense of being institutional, structural, embedded in the legal and economic fabric of a society in ways that individual bankruptcy or political change cannot simply dissolve. It is the wealth of entities, not just people, the wealth of dynasties that exist across human lifespans rather than within them. And Burns sits at the apex of such a dynasty, having maintained his personal control of the family's assets for well over a century, not through inheritance, through survival. The question of how he managed this before the specific radiation protocol that currently sustains him is one the show has never directly addressed, but the dynasty's existence implies an answer. Whatever Burns is doing now with weekly radiation treatments and disease equilibrium management, earlier versions of the same drive toward personal longevity were probably expressed through whatever technologies and methods were available in each period. The specific mechanism changes. The underlying motivation and the outcome, an extraordinary extension of one individual's control over the resources and people around them, stays constant. Burns has always been looking for ways to keep himself alive past his natural term. He has always had the resources to explore methods that are unavailable to ordinary people. And he has always had the ruthlessness to pursue those methods without the ethical constraints that would slow down someone with a less purely instrumental relationship to other human beings. The question the show implicitly raises but never answers is whether the current radiation protocol is the best version of what Burns has developed over his lifetime, or whether it represents a kind of dependency, a biological lock-in, where a method that was initially voluntary has become so thoroughly integrated into his body's functioning that it can no longer be unwound without killing him. A person who voluntarily begins a treatment that extends their life through managed radiation exposure might, over decades of such treatment, find that their body has adapted to the treatment to such a degree that discontinuing it is no longer an option. The treatment that was once a supplement becomes a necessity. The external support becomes an internal requirement. If Burns reached that point decades ago, then his current situation, the weekly appointments, the 7-day window between treatments, the absolute dependence on Smithers to maintain the schedule, is not just a medical regimen. It is a trap of his own construction. He found a way to extend his life indefinitely, and the cost of that extension is that he can never stop. He is not merely surviving. He is permanently committed to surviving, because the alternative to the weekly treatment is not a natural death at the end of a long life, but a collapse of artificially maintained biological systems that would have deteriorated to the point of failure decades ago without intervention. Burns is not choosing to live. Burns is condemned to live by the very mechanism he designed to protect himself. There is something almost tragic in this, though tragedy is not typically the emotional register in which Burns is presented. He is the show's primary villain, the embodiment of unchecked wealth and contemptuous power, and the show usually frames his various difficulties as the deserved consequences of a life built on exploitation. But the immortality question complicates that framing. A man who has been trapped for a century in a body that requires weekly maintenance just to avoid catastrophic system failure, surrounded by people who are loyal to his power rather than to him personally, watching every contemporary he ever had die while he keeps going, sustained by a routine that has become indistinguishable from imprisonment, that man is not straightforwardly villainous. He is something more complex, something older and stranger and perhaps more exhausted than villainy usually allows. Burns does not seem happy. The show occasionally gestures at the emptiness beneath the power. He has moments where the loneliness of his position breaks through the brittle shell of contempt and cruelty. He responds to kindness with something that looks almost like longing before he remembers himself and retreats behind the defenses of wealth and authority. He is a man who has everything and has had it for so long that having it means nothing anymore, and the only thing that gives his existence structure and purpose is the exercise of the power that his longevity and his resources provide. And the tragedy is that he cannot stop. He cannot age out of it. He cannot reach a point where the weight of his fortune becomes someone else's problem and he is free to simply exist without the obligation of maintaining the machine. The machine requires him, and he requires the machine. And the people of Springfield, drinking his water and breathing his air and cashing his checks, are the fuel that keeps both the man and the machine running indefinitely. There is a detail about Burns that the show drops very early in its run and almost never returns to, but which becomes more significant the longer you sit with the immortality question. Burns had a childhood. He had parents. He had a home before Springfield, a family context before the dynasty, a period of life before the wealth and the power became the whole of his identity. The show has depicted fragments of this early life in scattered flashback episodes, and those fragments paint a picture of a childhood that was, in its own way, as damaged as Homer's. Young Charles Montgomery Burns was a child of significant wealth but apparently limited warmth. The family's resources were extraordinary. The family's emotional landscape, based on the fragments the show offers, was not. He was shaped by a world that taught him to view other people primarily as instruments, and that lesson took hold so completely that by the time he was old enough to begin making independent decisions about his own life, he had no other framework for human relationship available to him. He did not become cruel because wealth made him that way. He became wealthy in the way that he did, through methods and at a cost to others that the show makes clear has always been significant, because cruelty was already the primary mode through which he related to the world. The wealth amplified it. The longevity allowed it to compound over more than a century until the cruelty and the power and the utter absence of any counterbalancing force within his life produced the Burns we know. A man who burns down whatever interferes with his interests, who poisons a town rather than spend $56 million fixing violations, who pursues a political refugee for 27 years because she destroyed a weapons lab, who keeps an incompetent safety inspector employed for decades because the incompetence serves the operation, who has spent a century accumulating every resource available to human acquisition while remaining, at his core, the same hollow vessel he probably always was. Burns does not glow because the radiation is turning him into something other than human. Burns glows because the radiation is the only thing keeping something that should have expired decades ago in a state that resembles life. He is not a villain who has been empowered by unusual circumstances. He is the natural end state of a very long life, lived entirely in service of power, extended past its natural term through the application of that same power to the question of biological survival. Springfield cannot kill him. Springfield cannot afford to. And Burns cannot die. Burns cannot permit himself to. The loop runs forever. The treatments come weekly. Smithers maintains the schedule. The reactor leaks. The water stays contaminated. And the oldest man in Springfield keeps signing the paychecks that keep the town alive, that keeps him alive, that keeps the town alive. The perfect system. The closed loop. The trap that both prisoner and warden chose together, so long ago that neither can remember a time before it. Number, Section 3 Extended. Homer's Lost Intelligence, What He Might Have Been. The episode where Homer has the crayon removed is not the only time the show gives us a glimpse of alternate Homer. It is the most direct and most fully developed version of that glimpse, but the show has been hinting at the man underneath the damage throughout its run, in ways that are easy to miss unless you are specifically looking for them. Homer, in his most impaired state, still demonstrates occasional flashes of genuine perceptiveness. Not often, not reliably, but they appear, usually in moments of emotional intensity, when the fog of cognitive impairment seems to thin enough for something underneath to briefly surface. He has moments of surprising emotional insight about other people. He has moments where his assessment of a situation cuts through to something real that the more apparently intelligent people around him have missed. He has moments where he says something simple and true that lands with a weight that his usual mode of speech does not carry. These moments are brief and quickly submerged again, but they are consistent enough to suggest that what the radiation and the crayon have done is not eliminate Homer's capacity for genuine thought. They have created noise. They have raised the threshold that a thought needs to clear in order to reach Homer's conscious awareness. Most thoughts do not clear it. The damage absorbs them before they become fully formed. But in moments of intensity, when some emotional surge provides enough energy to push through the noise, something older and sharper than Homer's usual self becomes briefly visible. That older, sharper self is the person Homer would have been without the damage. Not a genius. Not a genius in the Lisa mode, with the razor-edged analytical intelligence that makes her both brilliant and isolated. But something subtler and in some ways more useful. Genuine emotional acuity. The ability to read people accurately. The capacity for insight that does not arrive through analysis but through the kind of deep, sustained attention to other people that empathy, fully functional empathy, makes possible. This is actually visible in Homer's relationship with his children, which is the relationship that shows him at his most emotionally functional. Homer understands his children in ways that go beyond what his apparent cognitive level should allow. He knows what Bart needs in moments of real vulnerability, even when Bart is working very hard to prevent anyone from seeing the vulnerability. He knows how to reach Lisa when she has built her walls up highest, not through the intellectual engagement that Lisa's conscious mind prefers, but through the simpler, more direct language of a parent who simply refuses to be deterred by the child's defenses. He knows, somehow, when Maggie needs something specific, even when Maggie cannot communicate that need through any conventional channel. These are not the skills of a man with an IQ of 55. These are the residual capacities of a person who, without the damage, would have been remarkably good at understanding and connecting with the people around him. The emotional intelligence that occasionally surfaces in Homer is not a product of his impairment. It is a survivor of it. It persisted through everything that the crayon and the radiation and the decades of cognitive erosion took away, because it is so fundamental to what Homer is, so deeply wired into whatever his real self would have been, that even the most comprehensive damage to his higher cognitive functions could not eliminate it entirely. Now think about what this means for the conspiracy the show has built around Burns. Burns needed Homer compliant. He needed Homer unable to make the connections that would reveal the architecture of his own exploitation. He needed Homer to look at a workplace with 342 safety violations and respond with mild inconvenience rather than righteous clarity. He needed Homer to work for the man who destroyed his family without connecting those two facts in any sustained way that would produce action. The cognitive damage does all of that. It raises the threshold for connected thinking to such a level that Homer, in his normal state, cannot hold the elements of his situation in mind simultaneously long enough to see the pattern. He can know, in sequence, that Burns fired his mother into exile, that Burns employs him, that Burns's plant poisons the town he lives in. But he cannot hold all three things in mind at once and allow them to crystallize into the conclusion they demand. The information is present, the analytical capacity to connect it is not reliably available, but the emotional capacity is. And this is what makes Homer occasionally dangerous to the system in a way that the system has not fully accounted for. Homer's emotional intelligence, impaired but surviving, occasionally produces responses that bypass the cognitive damage entirely. He does not reason his way to understanding his situation. He feels his way there. And the feeling, when it comes, is sometimes accurate in ways that pure reasoning would not be, because feeling does not require the cognitive infrastructure that reasoning does, and the crayon and the radiation have damaged the cognitive infrastructure much more severely than they have damaged the emotional one. The episode where Homer has the crayon removed and becomes genuinely intelligent is interesting partly because of what it reveals about his analytical capacities when those capacities are restored. He immediately writes the accurate report about the plant's safety violations. He immediately understands the implications of his situation at the power plant. He immediately perceives the connection between Burns's operation and the environmental conditions of Springfield. All of this he does without significant effort in the early stages of having the crayon removed, as if the information was always there and the barrier was simply in the processing. But what the episode also reveals is something about the emotional cost of full intelligence in Springfield. Intelligent Homer is not just more analytically capable, he is more emotionally sensitive. He feels more. He processes the weight of his situation more fully. He cannot maintain the emotional equilibrium that impaired Homer achieves through the simple expedient of not fully understanding what he is feeling or why. Impaired Homer is emotionally resilient in a way that has always seemed like a feature of his character, but which the crayon episode reveals is actually a product of the damage. He bounces back from things that should flatten him because his processing of those things is incomplete. He experiences the emotional impact of a difficult event, but he does not continue experiencing it across time in the way that full cognitive function would allow. The processing stops. The weight does not accumulate the way it would in a healthy mind. Remove the crayon, restore the cognitive function, and Homer begins to carry the weight that had been passing through him unprocessed. He begins to understand, with full adult emotional capability, what his life actually consists of. And what his life actually consists of, examined clearly, is genuinely difficult. He has been failed by every institution that should have protected him. He has been deliberately diminished by the man who employs him. He has spent his adult life working for the person most responsible for his suffering without being capable of perceiving the connection. He has raised 3 children in an environment that has been poisoning them. He has been the least capable version of the person he should have been, not because of any failure of will or character, but because of systems that were specifically designed to produce that outcome. Intelligent Homer sees all of this, and it is unbearable. Not because Homer lacks the strength to bear it, but because bearing it would require acting on it, would require changing something, would require taking on the full weight of knowing what he knows and doing something proportionate to that knowledge. And in Springfield, doing something proportionate to that knowledge is essentially impossible because the systems that would need to be challenged to produce meaningful change are controlled by the man whose financial and institutional power makes challenge effectively futile. So, Homer chooses the crayon. He chooses the fog. He chooses the version of himself that does not know what he knows, because the version that does know cannot live inside the knowledge without it becoming the only thing that matters. This is not weakness. In the context of Springfield, it is the most rational available response to an impossible situation. Homer is not stupid because he lacks the capacity for intelligence. Homer chooses stupidity because intelligence in Springfield is not survival compatible. The town was designed to make it incompatible. And Homer, even in the act of choosing his own impairment, is demonstrating a kind of wisdom that the more apparently intelligent people around him have not achieved. Lisa has chosen the other path. Lisa has chosen to remain intelligent and to fight regardless of the cost. And the cost, across 36 years of episodes, has been relentless. The isolation, the mockery, the perpetual experience of being the smartest person in a room that has no interest in what the smartest person thinks, the crushing weight of caring about things that nobody around you cares about, the specific exhaustion of trying to make things better in a place that has decided things are fine the way they are. Lisa's path is heroic. It is also brutal. And Homer, watching his daughter carry that weight from early childhood, chose to put the crayon back partly because he could not bear the prospect of carrying a similar weight. He is not a coward. He is a person who correctly assessed the cost of consciousness in Springfield and concluded that the cost was too high. Burns designed the system to produce exactly that conclusion. And in that narrow sense, Homer choosing the crayon is Burns's most complete victory. Not because Homer was defeated by force, but because Homer, seeing clearly what his life was and what it cost him and what changing it would require, chose to stop seeing clearly, chose to return to the comfortable fog where the weight does not accumulate, and the connections do not crystallize, and the man who stole your mother is just the guy who signs your checks. That is what was taken from Homer. Not just his intelligence, his relationship to his own experience, his ability to live inside his life with the full awareness that life deserves. The man Homer might have been would have noticed what was happening to Springfield, would have had the sustained cognitive capacity to connect the evidence and maintain the connection long enough to act on it, would have had the emotional resources to bear the weight of knowing without retreating from the knowing. That man was destroyed before he was ever fully formed. He was destroyed by a crayon and a leaking reactor, and 27 years of growing up without a mother because a billionaire with a grudge decided that a housewife's activism deserved to be punished with everything he had. Homer will never know what he lost. He chose to stop knowing. That was the only mercy available, and it was a mercy that Burns made sure to provide, because a Homer who knew what he lost would be the most dangerous person in Springfield. Number. Section 4. Extended. Maggie's Endgame, and what silence costs. The silence has a price. This is not often discussed in analyses of Maggie Simpson, because the silence is usually examined as a strategy, which it is, and strategies that work tend to be evaluated primarily in terms of their effectiveness rather than their cost. Maggie's silence works. It is effective. It gives her operational freedom that she would not have if she were recognized as the extraordinarily capable person she appears to be. It allows her to act in spaces where she would otherwise be monitored and constrained. It gives her the crucial advantage of being systematically underestimated by every person in her environment, and underestimation, in Springfield, is a more valuable resource than almost anything else available. But silence has costs. All strategies do. The most obvious cost is connection. Maggie watches her family with an intelligence that can read them more accurately than they can read each other or themselves. She sees Homer's damage and understands its source in ways that Homer cannot access. She sees Lisa's exhaustion and understands that it comes from fighting in a way that Maggie has judged to be strategically unsound. Not because it is wrong, but because it is visible, and visibility in Springfield is punished. She sees Bart's misdirected energy and understands, probably, that what looks like chaos from the outside is actually a person with significant capability operating without an appropriate channel for that capability. She understands all of this, and she cannot do anything with it. Not directly, not in any way that involves communication, conversation, the shared language through which humans normally build the kind of connection that understanding another person is supposed to enable. Maggie's strategic choice, the choice to maintain her silence and her apparent helplessness, means that the understanding she has of her family stays entirely internal. It does not flow outward. It cannot be offered or reciprocated or built into the kind of relationship that shared understanding normally creates. This is the specific loneliness of Maggie Simpson, not the ordinary loneliness of a child who does not fit in, which is Lisa's loneliness and is miserable in its own way. The specific loneliness of a person who can see everything and says nothing, who knows what the people around her are carrying and cannot offer to help carry it, who watches the people she loves struggle with things she could potentially illuminate or address, and chooses, strategically, to let them struggle rather than reveal herself. That choice has weight. It accumulates. 36 years of watching Homer stumble through his damaged life without telling him what she sees. 36 years of watching Lisa fight battles that Maggie could potentially inform with everything her silence has allowed her to observe without offering that information. 36 years of watching the family navigate their various crises with less than the full knowledge available within their own household, because the family member with the most comprehensive understanding of their situation has decided, for very good reasons, that revealing that understanding is not safe. Maggie is alone in the most fundamental sense. She is alone inside the intelligence that was supposed to be an advantage. The radiation supercharged her cognition. The supercharged cognition enabled the strategic silence. The strategic silence enables the operational freedom. And the operational freedom comes at the cost of genuine connection with the people she loves. This is the reading of Maggie that complements the more triumphant version of the theory. Yes, she is the most capable member of the family. Yes, her silence is a strategy rather than a limitation. Yes, she is watching and waiting and planning in ways that nobody around her suspects. All of that is true. And simultaneously, she is a child who cannot speak openly to her mother, cannot play freely with her siblings, cannot let herself be fully known by anyone in her environment, because the moment she becomes fully known, the moment her capabilities are recognized and documented and associated with her publicly, she becomes a target rather than an advantage. Burns was born into an era and a class that expected to shape the world. He has spent over a century doing exactly that, through methods and at a cost that the show makes clear has always been severe. His power is overt. His authority is institutional. He does not need to hide what he is, because what he is coincides perfectly with what the structures of power in Springfield are designed to support. Maggie was born into a contaminated town, into a damaged family, in a world that has given her extraordinary capability and no legitimate channel through which to deploy it. She is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace and the one person on Evergreen Terrace who has absolutely no institutional support for her power. She has to work obliquely, invisibly, through the gaps and margins of a world that is not designed for what she is. The parallel to Burns is not accidental. They are in some sense the two poles of what the contamination of Springfield produces in its most extreme cases. Burns, who has had over a century to accumulate the institutional power that allows his capabilities to operate openly and without apology. Maggie, who is 1 year old and has known, from the earliest possible moment of genuine awareness, that her capabilities are something to hide rather than something to deploy directly. Burns made by history into someone who can be exactly what he is without concealment. Maggie made by circumstance into someone who can only be what she is in secret. What happens when they finally encounter each other directly, not as the billionaire employer and the infant in the parking lot of the Who Shot Mr. Burns episode, but as the two most capable minds in Springfield meeting with full mutual awareness? The show has never answered this. It has never staged this confrontation explicitly, but the architecture of the show suggests it is inevitable. Everything the show has built around both characters points toward a collision that has not yet happened. Burns is the most powerful person in Springfield's official power structure. Maggie is the most capable person operating outside of it. At some point, those two things have to meet. And when they do, Burns will have every institutional advantage. He will have money and infrastructure and decades of established authority. He will have Smithers and his medical protocol and the legal and regulatory apparatus he has built around his interests. Maggie will have 36 years of watching, of learning every system, every weakness, every gap in the defenses of a town she has studied in complete silence since she was old enough to register stimuli. She will have the most comprehensive intelligence operation in Springfield history, conducted entirely under the cover of being a baby who cannot talk. Burns is powerful. Maggie is prepared. And in Springfield, preparation has historically been more durable than power when it can be brought to bear. The problem is bringing it to bear without becoming visible, without losing the advantage of the silence that made the preparation possible. This is the question the show has been building toward for 36 years without quite asking it. Not who shot Mr. Burns, not where Springfield is, not whether Homer is dreaming, but whether Maggie Simpson, when she finally decides the moment has come and breaks her silence, will be able to change anything, or whether Springfield's systems of denial and institutional protection and collective amnesia are robust enough to absorb even the most prepared and most capable intervention. Whether the most powerful mind in Springfield can do what the show has suggested no one has ever managed to do. Not fight back against Burns. People have fought back. Not expose the truth has been exposed. But make the exposure stick. Make it real in a way that cannot be dismissed or forgotten or legally prohibited from being discussed. Make Springfield remember, against its will, against its structural incentive to forget what it has been doing to itself for 36 years. If anyone in Springfield can do that, it is Maggie. If anyone in Springfield can find the specific pressure point at which the machinery of collective denial breaks down, at which the vote to forget becomes impossible to cast and the decree expires and the truth has to be acknowledged, it is the person who has been studying that machinery in complete silence for the entirety of her conscious life. Maggie's endgame is the last truly unsolved mystery of The Simpsons, and it remains unsolved because the show cannot solve it without ending something, cannot allow Maggie to finally act, fully and openly and with the full weight of everything she has been preparing, without altering Springfield in ways that would make it unrecognizable, without breaking the loop, without in some sense ending the story. And we are not ready for the story to end. So Maggie waits, behind the pacifier, behind the enormous eyes, behind 36 years of strategic silence that has cost her everything and given her something no one else in Springfield has. The truth, intact, uncompromised, held safe in the mind of the only person who was smart enough to never speak it aloud. Number, Section 5 extended. The nuclear conspiracy, the human cost. The 342 violations are not abstract regulatory failures. Each one represents a specific mechanism through which the plant's operation causes harm to the people in its vicinity. And the cumulative weight of 342 specific failures, running continuously for decades, is a weight that the show gestures at constantly but never fully unpacks. Let us try to unpack it. Radioactive waste disposal into local waterways. This is one of the documented violations. Not waste that accidentally leaches into the groundwater through infrastructure failures, which is itself a significant concern in any nuclear facility operating with the kind of deferred maintenance Burns has allowed. Direct disposal, active dumping of radioactive material into the water that Springfield's residents drink, and that Springfield's fish swim in, and that Springfield's children play near. The three-eyed fish, Blinky, is the most visible consequence of this violation, and the show presents him as a curiosity, a symbol, an argument in an election. But Blinky is not just a symbol. He is a measurement. He is the visible evidence of what the radioactive material in the water is doing to the biology of organisms that live in it, and the specific nature of his mutation, a third eye, represents a fundamental alteration in the developmental programming of a living organism caused by external chemical or radiation exposure during a critical developmental period. What the show does not follow, but the radiation theory demands you follow, is the chain of causation from Blinky to the people. If the radioactive material in the water is sufficient to produce a third eye in a fish, what is it doing to human tissue? Human tissue is more complex than fish tissue in many ways, but not necessarily more robust against specific forms of radiation damage. The kinds of damage that produce visible mutations in fish, the disruption of developmental biology, the alteration of gene expression in rapidly dividing cells, these mechanisms do not become inert when the organism ingesting the radioactive material is human rather than Piscine. The yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the physical proportions that deviate from normal human anatomy, the extraordinary physical resilience that allows Homer to survive injuries that should be fatal. These are not art-style choices that happen to resemble what radiation exposure does to living organisms. They are, under the radiation theory, exactly what radiation exposure does to living organisms, expressed across a population that has been exposed continuously for decades. And then there are the subtler effects, the ones that do not show up in the visual representation of the characters but that the show describes directly. The cognitive impairment that is distributed broadly across Springfield's population, the emotional dysregulation that makes the town simultaneously docile and capable of sudden, intense, directionless collective action. The memory failures that the show depicts as comedy but that the radiation theory reads as neurological damage. The inability to sustain the kind of long-term strategic engagement that addressing the root cause of Springfield's problems would require. These are the effects that serve Burns most directly. Not the visual mutations, which are striking and visible and might, in a world with a functioning regulatory apparatus, draw investigative attention. The cognitive effects, which are invisible and dispersed, and impossible to attribute to a specific cause without the kind of sustained scientific investigation that the affected population does not have the cognitive resources to demand. Burns does not need to actively suppress resistance to his operation in Springfield. He does not need to threaten people or buy people off at an individual level, though he certainly does both of those things as needed. The contamination itself does the primary work. A population that cannot consistently connect information across time to identify patterns. A population that forgets its own collective traumas. A population that experiences the impulse toward action but cannot sustain it long enough for the impulse to crystallize into organized effort. This is the population that chronic radiation exposure at the level Springfield has experienced would predictably produce. And this is the population that Burns has maintained, for decades, through the strategic decision not to fix the violations that produce it. The human cost of the nuclear conspiracy is not abstract. It is Homer's crayon and the question of whether someone knew it was there. It is Mona Simpson's exile, made possible partly by a town that has never developed the sustained collective capacity to challenge the person responsible. It is Lisa's isolation, in a community whose cognitive environment makes genuine intellectual curiosity a disability rather than an asset. It is every resident of Springfield who has been yellow since birth without knowing why, who has 4 fingers without knowing why, who bounces back from physical trauma that should be permanently debilitating without knowing why, who cannot hold a thought across time long enough to become truly dangerous to the system that produced all of these conditions. It is the human cost that Burns refuses to account for, because accounting for it would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean someone might start asking questions that Burns cannot afford to have asked. The skeletons in the basement are the human cost made literal. Whatever happened to those people, whatever series of events ended with human remains in the basement of a working nuclear facility, happened because the safety standards that would have prevented it were not maintained. Because the inspector responsible for enforcing those standards was asleep at his console. Because the billionaire who owned the facility concluded that the cost of preventing the outcome that produced the skeletons was higher than the cost of the outcome itself. Burns made a calculation. In his calculation, the bones in the basement were acceptable. The 3-eyed fish was acceptable. The yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the crayon in Homer's brain and the 27 years of Mona Simpson's exile were all acceptable. Every human cost that the operation of the plant produced was acceptable, because the alternative, accepting the costs himself in the form of safety expenditure and regulatory compliance, and the reduced profit margins that honesty about the plant's impact would necessitate, was unacceptable. This is the banality that makes the nuclear conspiracy the most disturbing thing in Springfield's history. Not the individual decisions, not any single moment of villainous choice-making, but the sustained, decades-long pattern of making the calculation in the same direction every time it needed to be made. The accumulated weight of always deciding that the cost to other people is acceptable and the cost to yourself is not. Applied consistently, over years, over generations, over the entire lifespan of a community. That is the conspiracy. Not a dramatic secret meeting, not a shadowy cabal. Just a man who owns a plant and a plant that poisons people, and a man who has decided every morning for 36 years that this is acceptable. And a town that drinks the water. Number Section 6, Extended. The coma theory, what the dream reveals. The coma theory is most often discussed in terms of what it explains about the show's structural features. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, The progressive disconnection from physical reality. These are the things the theory resolves most elegantly, and they are the things that get the most attention when people engage with the theory seriously. But there is another dimension to the coma reading that gets less attention and is arguably more interesting. What does the content of the dream reveal about Homer's unconscious mind? What does the specific character of the world that Homer's sleeping brain has generated tell us about who Homer is at a level deeper than his waking personality? Dreams are not random. Even disturbed, deteriorating dreams generated by a damaged brain are not purely random noise. They are assembled from materials that have significance to the dreaming mind. The specific people who populate a dream, the specific scenarios they enact, the specific emotional registers those scenarios operate in, these are determined by the things the dreaming mind cares about most deeply. The fears and longings and unresolved tensions that shape the dream's landscape. Homer's dream is filled with family. Almost every significant storyline, every emotional arc, every moment of genuine weight in the episodes that the coma theory would attribute to the dream comes back to the family in one way or another. Homer's adventures, however implausible or disconnected from physical reality, almost invariably begin from or return to the family context. The relationships within the family are the emotional core of the dream, in the same way they were the emotional core of Homer's waking life before the vending machine fell. This tells us something important about Homer. It tells us that the thing his unconscious mind generates, when left to its own devices, when the structures and distractions of waking life are removed and only the deepest contents of his mental architecture remain, is family. Not adventure, not success. Not the kind of achievement or recognition that the post-coma episodes sometimes seem to offer Homer temporarily before the reset restores the baseline. Just family. The house on Evergreen Terrace and the people in it. This is Homer's truth. The one thing that his damaged brain, running a simulation without access to new information, without the ability to update from the outside world, generates continuously and obsessively from the materials available. He does not dream about being rich. He does not dream about being recognized by Burns, or about achieving the kind of status that his waking self so often and so unsuccessfully pursues. He dreams about his wife still being there, about his children still being young, about Friday nights and cold beer and the specific domestic warmth of a house that is too small and too loud and full of the specific people he most cannot bear to be without. The post-coma episodes are not a random collection of adventures. They are a systematic exploration of everything Homer was afraid might not be true. He was afraid Marge might leave him. The dream generates multiple storylines in which this fear is confronted and resolved, in which Marge and Homer face marital pressure and come back to each other. He was afraid his children might grow up into people he did not recognize. The dream keeps them perpetually the ages he knew, perpetually legible, perpetually accessible to the kind of relationship he had with them on the day the vending machine fell. He was afraid of dying without meaning. The dream generates an endless series of situations in which Homer is the one who saves the day, who matters, whose presence and whose love are the factors that determine whether things go wrong or right. None of this is wish fulfillment in the superficial sense of the word. It is not Homer dreaming about being rich or famous or powerful, though the post-coma episodes do give him access to all of those things on a temporary basis. It is something more fundamental. Homer dreaming about being enough, about being a good enough father, a good enough husband, a good enough person, to deserve the specific family that his unconscious mind keeps generating with such insistence and such love. The dream is an argument. It is Homer's unconscious mind making the case, across decades of increasingly implausible storylines, that this man, this damaged, impaired, chaotic, occasionally catastrophic, but also deeply loving and genuinely trying man, deserves his family, deserves to have them, deserves to be with them, deserves the specific warmth of the specific house on the specific street in the specific town that his sleeping brain cannot stop generating, because generating it is the only way to stay near the people he cannot reach. If the coma theory is true, then every absurd adventure, every impossible survival, every celebrity encounter, every alternate career, every scheme that goes wrong, and every disaster that somehow resolves, is Homer's unconscious mind running simulations of the specific question that his sleeping self most needs answered. Am I enough? Is my love sufficient? Will they be okay without me? Will they wait? The dream cannot answer these questions definitively. Dreams cannot do that, but the dream can keep asking them. Keep approaching them from different angles. Keep generating new scenarios in which the question arises and can be provisionally resolved. And provisionally, episode by episode, storyline by storyline, the answer the dream keeps producing is the same. Yes, Homer is enough. The family stays together. The house remains standing. The children are still there at the end of every episode. Marge still loves him. The dream insists on this. It insists on it against every plot that threatens to disrupt it, against every guest character who tries to replace Homer, against every crisis that threatens to dissolve the family, against every episode that introduces a force that might permanently alter the domestic landscape of Evergreen Terrace. The dream resets. Every time. The threat is absorbed, the status quo is restored. And Homer, somewhere in a hospital bed in Springfield General, keeps dreaming the only dream worth dreaming, that his family is okay, that they are all still there, that nobody has had to say goodbye yet, the most mundane possible ambition, the most ordinary possible paradise, the kind of heaven that only makes sense to people who understand that the ordinary things, the specific people, the specific warmth, the specific chaos of a specific family in a specific house are not ordinary at all, that they are the whole of everything worth having, that their loss would be a loss of all meaning, and that the only sufficient response to the threat of that loss is to dream and keep dreaming, and never let the dream end. Homer is not a saint or a hero. He is not wise or disciplined or admirable in the ways that admirable people typically are. He is damaged and limited and frequently chaotic and occasionally catastrophic. He has made mistakes that have cost people around him dearly. He has failed to be what the people he loves needed him to be more times than any fair count would excuse. But he loves his family with everything that has survived the crayon and the radiation and the 36 years of accumulated damage. He loves them past the point where the specific neurons that would normally manage and moderate and express that love are still fully functional. He loves them in the parts of himself that the damage could not reach, in whatever is deepest and most fundamental about what Homer Simpson is. And the dream keeps going. Because the man who loves like that does not let the dream end. Even if ending it would mean waking up. Even if waking up would be the braver thing. The dream keeps going because Homer Simpson, in the deepest available version of himself, is not ready for it to be over. And the show, in 36 years of honoring that refusal, has never been ready either. Number. Section 7. Extended. The Burns shooting the mechanics of a cover-up. The question of who shot Burns is a mystery about evidence. But underneath the mystery about evidence is a different kind of question, which is a question about power. Specifically, who in Springfield has the power to determine what the official account of an event will be and who does not? The official account of the Burns shooting required several things to be true simultaneously. It required the forensic evidence, the DNA eyelash, to be attributed to Maggie rather than to the other Simpson family members whose DNA it could equally well have indicated. It required Burns's testimony, delivered from a hospital bed by a man recovering from a gunshot wound, to be accepted as reliable despite the significant medical and psychological literature suggesting that witness testimony under those conditions is among the most unreliable available. It required the sundial evidence, which Burns himself stated was not intentional, to be treated as the central piece of identifying information. And it required an investigation conducted by Chief Wiggum, who has demonstrated across hundreds of episodes that his investigative capabilities are essentially non-functional, to be accepted as definitive. Every one of these requirements is individually questionable. Taken together, they produce an official account that has fewer evidentiary supports than the charge it supports requires. A competent legal challenge to the verdict naming Maggie as the shooter would have a significant amount of material to work with. But who conducts that challenge? The victim is Burns, the richest man in Springfield, the man whose financial influence reaches into every corner of the town's institutional life. The man whose relationship with Mayor Quimby, with the police department, with the judicial apparatus, has been established across multiple episodes as one of client and patron. Burns does not challenge the verdict because Burns benefits from it. Maggie cannot be prosecuted. Homer's fingerprints on the gun, explained away by the investigation as an intermediate stage of the weapon's chain of custody rather than as evidence of his involvement, cease to be an active problem once the verdict is rendered. The case is closed. No one currently in Springfield has the institutional standing to challenge it. This is how cover-ups work, not through dramatic interventions or shadowy operations, through the quiet operation of power at the procedural level, through the simple reality that the people who have the standing to challenge an official determination are the same people who benefit from that determination going unchallenged. The system does not need to be corrupt in a dramatic and explicit way to produce outcomes that serve the interests of the most powerful party. It just needs to work the way it works, consistently and without deviation, and the most powerful party will almost always find that it works in their favor. Burns wanted a verdict that closed the case with minimal disruption to the status quo. A verdict that named someone who could not be prosecuted. A verdict that directed investigative attention away from anyone who might, if prosecuted and given a platform, begin talking about things Burns did not want talked about in a public legal proceeding. A verdict that let everyone go home and forget it happened. He got exactly that. Because in Springfield, the most powerful party always gets what it wants from the institutions it has been shaping for decades. The alternate endings, the Smithers version and the Barney version that were seriously considered before the writers settled on Maggie, there are interesting evidence not just for the construction of the mystery, but for what they reveal about the institutional logic the show was working with. Smithers knows Burns' schedule. Smithers had just been fired. Smithers has the kind of specific operational knowledge of Burns' habits and vulnerabilities that makes him uniquely dangerous when his loyalty is withdrawn. Barney had a different set of vulnerabilities and frustrations that the show was exploring at the time. Both of these alternatives were more institutionally logical than Maggie as a shooter, in the sense that both of them involved characters whose relationship with Burns gave them specific access and specific grievance that would have been legible within the show's established character dynamics. The decision to go with Maggie was a creative choice that the evidence, as constructed in Part 1, does not fully support. Which brings us to Homer's Season 18 confession. Homer says, on camera, in a canonical episode, that he shot Mr. Burns. He states this as a fact, not as a joke, not in a context where the statement is clearly meant to be taken ironically. He claims responsibility for an act of violence against his employer. And the show lets the statement exist, lets it sit in the canon, and does nothing with it. Two possibilities. Either Homer is lying, perhaps for attention, perhaps as a kind of dark humor, perhaps because his damaged memory has generated a false recollection, or Homer is telling the truth, and has been living for several seasons with the knowledge that his infant daughter took official responsibility for something he did, and has decided that this is an acceptable outcome because the alternative, correcting the record, would expose him to prosecution and the family to consequences. Homer choosing to let Maggie take the blame, if that is what happened, would be a deeply, morally compromised decision. It would also be entirely characteristic of Homer in situations where the instinct towards self-preservation conflicts with his other values. Homer is not a coward, but he is a person who has consistently demonstrated that his ability to reason through complex moral situations is significantly impaired by his cognitive limitations. He might have decided that Maggie was safe, that the verdict protected her, that correcting it would help no one and expose him specifically. He might have made this calculation without fully processing its implications for Maggie's future understanding of her own history. Or he might simply not remember clearly enough to be certain. The episode of the shooting, the period surrounding it, was a time of significant emotional and physical stress. Homer's memory under normal conditions is compromised. Under conditions of intense stress surrounding a violent event involving his employer, his family, and ultimately his own freedom when he becomes the primary suspect, the memory of what actually happened may be so disrupted as to be genuinely unreliable. Homer might not know whether he shot Burns. He might have a feeling, a strong conviction, that he did, without the specific episodic memory that would constitute reliable testimony about it. He might be claiming responsibility based on an emotional sense of guilt that does not correspond to the actual events of that night. All of which is a way of saying, the mystery is still open. It was open the night it was officially closed. It has been open for 30 years. And the evidence for Maggie as the shooter is, on careful examination, significantly weaker than the show's official conclusion requires it to be. Someone in Springfield knows the truth. Burns knows it. Whoever it was that he greeted with, "Oh, it's you," knows it. The rest of Springfield has accepted the verdict that was most convenient for all the parties with the power to determine what the verdict would be. That is how it works in Springfield. That is how it has always worked. The truth goes in the file gets closed, and Springfield moves on. Number Section 8 Extended. Mona Simpson, the Activist and the Empire. Mona Simpson's story does not end with her death. In some ways, it does not begin with the biological weapons lab raid in 1969. It begins much earlier, with the woman she was before the activism, and the question the show never quite asks is what the activism reveals about who that woman was. The show depicts Mona's radicalization as something that happened to her, an encounter with the counterculture that transformed a conventional housewife into someone capable of organizing a raid on a germ warfare facility. This is probably the most comfortable version of the story because it preserves the narrative of an ordinary person pushed to extraordinary action by extraordinary circumstances. The world was burning. She responded to the burning. But the raid itself suggests something more. You do not organize an effective break-in to a secured biological weapons laboratory because you got caught up in the spirit of the 1960s. That requires planning, technical knowledge, operational discipline, and the specific kind of courage that is not just emotional bravery but strategic commitment. The group Mona worked with succeeded. They entered the facility, located the biological agents, destroyed them, and exited without being captured, with the exception of Mona's own decision to stop and help the injured Burns. This is not the action of people who were swept up in a movement. This is the action of people who knew what they were doing, who had skills and commitment, and the ability to execute a plan under pressure. Mona had those things. She had them before she met the counterculture. The counterculture gave her a cause and a framework. She brought the capability herself, which means the woman Burns turned into a fugitive was not just a housewife who got radicalized. She was a person with genuine capability who applied that capability to a cause she believed was worth the cost. The cost, as it turned out, was everything: her family, her freedom, her ability to watch her son grow up, her ability to be present for the specific daily accumulation of moments that makes up a relationship between a parent and a child. She paid it. She paid it not because she did not love Homer. The show makes abundantly clear that she loved Homer with the specific intensity of a parent who chose sacrifice precisely because the love was too real to compromise it by doing something that would have put him at risk. She paid it because she had looked at what Burns was doing, specifically at the biological weapons program, and concluded that the cost of allowing it to continue was higher than the cost of stopping it. This is the calculation that the people of Springfield have never been able to make, collectively, about the nuclear plant. The cost of the plant continuing to run the way it runs is very high. It is paid continuously by the bodies and the minds of every person in the contamination zone. But the cost is diffuse, invisible, accumulated over years, impossible to attribute to any specific cause, in a way that produces the kind of decisive individual moral clarity that motivated Mona's action in 1969. Mona saw a specific harm, a biological weapons program, located in her town, operated by the man who already owned her community's power supply. She assessed the harm and acted. She was capable of that assessment and that action because, unlike the residents of Springfield who have been drinking the contaminated water since before most of them were born, she had not been cognitively impaired by decades of exposure to the contamination the plant was already producing. She acted while she still could, before the water got into her thinking in the specific ways it has gotten into the thinking of every Springfield resident who came after her. And Burns's response to her action was to ensure that nobody else in Springfield would ever be in a similar position, not through dramatic intervention, through the simple mechanism of continuing to run the plant the way he ran it, continuing to contaminate the water, continuing to let the violations go unfixed, continuing to employ the safety inspector whose incompetence ensures the contamination keeps building. Year by year, generation by generation, the cognitive environment of Springfield gets slightly more impaired. The capacity for the kind of clear-eyed moral assessment that Mona performed in 1969 gets slightly harder to access. The activation threshold for the kind of decisive, organized action that her group executed gets slightly higher. Burns does not need to defeat the next Mona Simpson before she acts. He just needs to ensure the conditions that produced her are progressively eliminated from Springfield's environment. And the plant, running continuously with its violations unfixed, does that work automatically and invisibly and without any need for specific targeting or dramatic intervention. Mona fought back. She lost. And her loss made the next fight harder, and the next one harder still. The water keeps flowing, the contamination keeps building, the cognitive baseline keeps declining, and the town keeps forgetting. That is the war she fought. That is the war she lost. And her son, drinking the water in the house that runs on the plant's electricity, does not know it was ever fought at all. Section 9 extended. The prediction phenomenon, the shows that failed. Every serious discussion of the Simpsons prediction phenomenon eventually encounters the same deflating but necessary observation. The predictions that did not come true vastly outnumber the ones that did. This is not a small consideration that the confirmation bias argument dispatches quickly and moves on from. It is the central fact around which the entire prediction conversation should organize itself, because it is the fact that changes the character of everything else. The hundreds of accurate-seeming predictions look different when you understand they exist within a sea of predictions that went nowhere, that depicted futures that never materialized, that were specific and confident about directions the world did not take. The jetpacks never arrived. In various episodes across various seasons, the show depicted a near future in which personal air travel via jetpack was a common mode of transportation. This has not happened. It has been not happening for decades. The specific version of technological progress that the show anticipated, in which miniaturized flight technology became democratized and accessible to ordinary people, has not materialized in the form the show suggested it would. Flying cars, depicted in future Springfield with a frequency that suggests the writers genuinely expected this technology to develop along a certain timeline, have also not arrived. Not in any commercially meaningful form. Not in the form that the show's various flash-forward episodes depicted. The infrastructure for personal aerial transportation that several episodes imagined as the obvious next step from the automobile has simply not developed. There were predicted political outcomes that went the other direction. Characters who were expected to win elections and did not. Institutional collapses that were depicted as imminent and turned out to be decades away or not to happen at all. Cultural shifts that were depicted as inevitable and turned out to be either much slower or much different in character than the show anticipated. Social movements that the show predicted would develop in specific directions and that developed in completely different ones. All of these miss the highlight reel entirely. Nobody shares the clips from episodes where The Simpsons got the future wrong, because getting the future wrong is not emotionally interesting in the same way that getting it right is. The misses do not activate the mixture of amazement and unease that drives viral sharing. They just sit in the archive, unremarkable, unnoticed, slowly accumulating as evidence that the show is a television program staffed by smart human beings who are trying to be funny and insightful, not a prophetic oracle with privileged access to the future. But here's the interesting thing about the misses. They are not random. They cluster around specific kinds of predictions, specific types of extrapolation, specific modes of thinking about the future that the show repeatedly deployed and that repeatedly turned out to be wrong in instructive ways. The show was consistently wrong about the pace of technological progress. It repeatedly depicted futures in which certain technologies arrived faster than they actually did. Personal flight, artificial intelligence of a specific kind, certain medical technologies, the specific texture of how digital communication would develop. In almost every case where the show overestimated the pace of progress, the overestimate went in the direction of assuming that things that were already developing would continue developing on a smooth upward trajectory without the bumps, redirections, regulatory interventions, and economic constraints that actually shape technological development in the real world. The predictions that landed were the ones based on observations about human behavior and institutional patterns rather than predictions about specific technologies. Trump was not a prediction about technology. It was a prediction about how Americans relate to celebrity and authority and the spectacle of politics, which are things that change much more slowly than technology does, and that the show, with its deep investment in observing American cultural patterns, was better positioned to read accurately. The Disney-Fox merger was not a prediction about a specific business decision. It was an extrapolation from an observable trend in media consolidation that had been running for decades, and that the writers, several of whom had graduate training in fields that involve careful analysis of institutional behavior, could see was heading toward specific structural outcomes. The trend was real. The endpoint was foreseeable. The specific form the endpoint took was a function of timing and opportunity that could not be predicted precisely. But the general shape of it, large entertainment companies absorbing smaller ones, was practically a certainty rather than a prediction. The show is most accurate in retrospect when it is doing what good satire always does, identifying something that is already true about the present and making it more visible by exaggerating it slightly and allowing the audience to see it from an angle that their normal relationship with it prevents. The Trump prediction worked because the cultural conditions for a Trump presidency were already present and had been present for a long time. The writers did not forecast those conditions. They observed them and wrote a joke. The predictions that fail tend to be the ones where the writers moved from observation to invention, where they stopped extrapolating from what was already there and started imagining what might arrive. The jetpack prediction fails because jetpacks are not an extrapolation from something observable in the present, but an invention of a specific technological future that has consistently failed to materialize because the specific obstacles to its development, energy density, weight, safety, regulatory frameworks, turn out to be more persistent than the optimism of the 1990s anticipated. The lesson of the misses is the same as the lesson of the hits, just stated negatively. The show is not a prophet, it is a mirror. It shows the present with unusual clarity, and the predictions that land are the ones where the present, already, contained the future within it in a form legible to careful observers. The predictions that miss are the ones where the writers went looking beyond the present into actual speculation, into the territory of genuine forecasting rather than acute observation. Which means the proper frame for understanding the prediction phenomenon is not, how did they know? The proper frame is, what were they seeing? What features of the American present, in 1995 or 2000 or 2007, were so clearly visible to people paying very careful attention that the logical extension of those features produced something that looked, 16 years later, like prophecy? The answer is almost always something about power, about wealth, about the relationship between concentrated private power and democratic institutions, about the specific ways in which celebrity culture and political culture had begun to merge, about the direction in which media ownership was consolidating, about the specific character of American institutional failure and the specific groups of people who were positioned to exploit that failure for their own benefit. The show saw these things clearly because the show was built around seeing them. The Simpsons is, at its core, a show about what it looks like when the systems that are supposed to protect ordinary people do not work the way they are supposed to work, and about how ordinary people navigate lives inside those failing systems. Every episode is, at some level, a story about power and its failures and its costs. A show that has been telling that story carefully for 36 years, with a writing staff that includes people trained to think analytically about those specific questions, will inevitably produce observations that turn out to be accurate about the future. Not because the writers have access to the future, because the present they are observing is already, always, becoming the future. The direction was visible. The endpoint was implied. The show wrote it down, and the rest of the world caught up. Number section 10 extended, Springfield's collective amnesia, the social mechanics. The specific mechanism by which Springfield forgets things is worth examining more carefully than the broad strokes of the principle and the pauper argument typically allows. The show has given us multiple examples of the forgetting in action, and they are not all the same. They work through different mechanisms that share an underlying structure but that operate in distinct ways depending on the nature of the event being forgotten. Some forgettings are economic. The dome, the sun-blocking disk, the various near catastrophes at the nuclear plant. These events are forgotten partly because remembering them would create economic disruption that Springfield's residents cannot afford. The town depends on Burns for its economic livelihood. Challenging Burns on the basis of evidence that his operations have repeatedly endangered the community would, at minimum, create a period of economic uncertainty during which the town's residents would face the specific material hardships that follow from disrupting the primary local employer. The calculus is not comfortable, but it is legible. People choose not to remember the dome, because remembering it leads to places that are materially threatening. Some forgettings are social. The Skinner identity case is the clearest example. The truth about Armin Tamzarian is not economically threatening. Acknowledging it does not put anyone's livelihood at risk. The reason the town votes to forget it is more purely social. Acknowledging it would disrupt the established relationships and established understandings that give Springfield's social fabric its texture. People relate to Skinner as Skinner. They understand their relationship to him through the accumulated history of interactions that were conducted under the assumption that he was who he claimed to be. Dismantling that assumption requires dismantling the relational infrastructure built on it, and that dismantling is costly in ways that have nothing to do with economics. This is the amnesia that small communities practice most fluently, the forgetting of things that would, if remembered, require everyone to renegotiate their understanding of their relationships to each other. The past in small communities is not just history. It is the foundation of current social structure. Changing the past, acknowledging that the past was different than understood, changes the current structure in ways that are frequently uncomfortable and sometimes threatening. Small communities develop strong implicit agreements about what the official past will be allowed to contain, and those agreements are enforced not through legal mechanisms but through the powerful social pressure of collective memory management. Springfield is not unique in this. Every small town has its stories that everyone knows are not quite accurate but that everyone also knows not to challenge, because the official version is doing structural work that the accurate version would destabilize. Springfield is just more explicit about it. Springfield voted on it. Springfield made it official. Springfield let you watch. The third type of forgetting is the one most specifically attributable to the radiation theory's framework. The forgetting that is not a choice but an incapacity. The kind of forgetting that results from neurological damage that impairs the brain's ability to consolidate episodic memories across time. The kind of forgetting that makes it difficult to hold a complex narrative involving multiple events spread over extended time in mind with sufficient clarity and continuity to act on it. This is the forgetting that serves Burns most directly because it operates below the level of choice. You cannot vote to remember something that your brain cannot consolidate into accessible long-term memory. You cannot choose to connect dots that your damaged cognitive processing cannot hold simultaneously. This type of forgetting is not a social decision or an economic calculation. It is a biological limitation, produced by the chronic environmental contamination of the town's primary water supply. And this is the type of forgetting that the principle and the pauper argument most specifically cannot account for, because the principle and the pauper argument is about deliberate collective choice. The community deliberates. The community votes. The community formalizes the forgetting through legal mechanisms. But there is forgetting in Springfield that precedes deliberation, forgetting that happens before anyone gets a chance to vote, because the event has not been consolidated into the kind of accessible long-term memory that would make it available for deliberation in the first place. The dome is forgotten not just because the town chose to forget it, but because many of the town's residents, their episodic memory functions impaired by chronic radiation exposure, were not able to maintain the memory of it clearly enough for long enough to bring it forward into the kind of sustained community conversation that would be necessary to address it. The three-eyed fish is not just forgotten because the town voted to ignore it. It is forgotten partly because the specific act of sustained attention required to hold the connection between the three-eyed fish and the nuclear plant's waste disposal practices and the health of the local water supply requires the kind of multi-step cognitive processing across time that the contaminated water is specifically impeding in the people who need to perform it. Burns's most elegant achievement is this: the mechanism of suppression and the mechanism of contamination operate together in ways that make the contamination self-concealing. The radiation impairs the cognitive function that would be necessary to recognize and respond to the radiation's effects. The forgetting is produced by the thing that most needs to be remembered. The cover-up is embedded in the crime. This is not a conspiracy in the sense of a planned mechanism designed specifically to achieve this outcome. Burns did not sit down in the 1800s and engineer a system in which radioactive contamination would suppress its own recognition. He just ran the plant the way he ran it, with the violations unfixed and the costs externalized, for the reasons that wealthy people who own industrial facilities always externalize costs, which is that externalizing them is profitable, and the people who bear the externalized costs rarely have the power to force them to be internalized. The self-concealing property of the contamination is a side effect, a fortunate accident from Burns's perspective. The thing that should have ended his operation decades ago, the mounting evidence of biological impact on Springfield's residents, also happens to impair the cognitive function that would be required to mount the sustained, organized, evidence-based challenge to the operation that the evidence demands. Springfield does not just forget. Springfield is designed to forget, not by Burns's specific intention, though Burns has certainly benefited from the design and has made every decision that perpetuates it, but by the accumulated weight of economic dependence and social pressure and neurological impairment that together produce a community permanently incapable of doing the one thing that its situation most requires: looking clearly at itself and recognizing what it sees. The real Seymour Skinner was expelled from Springfield because he showed up with an inconvenient truth. The truth was expelled with him. But the real Seymour Skinner was never the only inconvenient truth in Springfield. He was just the one that showed up in person and demanded recognition. The other inconvenient truths are still there. They have always been there. They are in the water and the air and the bodies of the people who have lived inside the contamination zone for decades without knowing that is what it is. They are in the bones in the basement of the nuclear plant. They are in the medical protocol that keeps Burns alive. They are in the crayon that was in Homer's brain and the question of whether someone knew it was there. They are in the file that says Maggie shot Mr. Burns in the season 18 episode where Homer says he did it, and the complete silence that followed. They are everywhere in Springfield. Available, present, accessible to anyone willing to look. And Springfield, collectively, has made sure that looking is as difficult as possible. Not through conspiracy, through the accumulated effect of choosing, every time, the version of the story that is most comfortable, the version that requires the least disruption, the version that allows everyone to go home to their yellow families in their yellow houses, in their yellow town, and drink the water and watch the TV and go to bed and wake up tomorrow the same as they were today. Springfield is not unique. Every community manages its truth this way, negotiates it, curates it, decides what the official version will be, and enforces that version through the thousand small social mechanisms of reputation and relationship and belonging that make life in a community worth having and make departing from the consensus uncomfortable enough that most people choose compliance over disruption. Springfield just does it more thoroughly, more honestly, more completely, because Springfield has more to forget, and the thing it most needs to forget has been helping it forget for 36 years. The water is still contaminated. The fish still have 3 eyes. Burns is still alive and signing the checks. Homer is still in Sector 7G. The cooling towers are still cracked. And Springfield will wake up tomorrow and forget all of that again. Because that is what Springfield does. That is what Springfield has always done. That is the only thing, finally, that Springfield is truly, reliably, absolutely consistent about. It forgets. And the loop runs on. Good night. Number. A final note on what the show is. 36 years is a long time to tell a story. Most stories have a shape. They start somewhere, they move through something, they arrive somewhere else. The characters who begin the story are changed by the end of it. The world the story inhabits is different at the conclusion than it was at the opening. This is the fundamental grammar of narrative. The thing that storytelling does that distinguishes it from mere documentation. It transforms, it moves, it produces change. The Simpsons does not do this. The Simpsons has never done this. And the most important question the theories in this video are all circling, the question they approach from every angle and with every framework available, is whether the show's refusal to change is a failure of narrative ambition or the most ambitious narrative statement the show has ever made. Every theory lands on the same underlying observation, which is that something is wrong in Springfield. The radiation produces wrongness in the biological sense. The coma produces wrongness in the ontological sense. The collective denial produces wrongness in the social and moral sense. The Burns conspiracy produces wrongness in the political and economic sense. Each framework identifies a different layer of wrongness and offers a different mechanism for how it operates. But they all converge on the same town, the same family, the same house on the same street, and they all conclude that the surface of that house, the warmth and the comedy and the couch gag and the beer and the Saturday morning cartoons and all the other machinery of domestic normalcy that the show deploys with such skill, sits over something that is not normal at all. The wrongness is the show's truth. And the show's truth is that the wrongness is invisible to the people inside it. Homer cannot see that he is damaged. He cannot see clearly enough to see the damage. The damage is itself the thing that prevents him from seeing it. Burns can see everything clearly because he has spent over a century acquiring the specific resources that protect him from the conditions he imposes on others. The people of Springfield cannot see what the water is doing to them because the water is doing it to the part of their minds that would perceive the doing. This is the American story that the show has been telling for 36 years, under the cover of animation and comedy and the specific disarming warmth of a family that loves each other in the middle of everything. not the story of a family conquering adversity. The story of a family absorbing adversity so completely that the adversity becomes invisible, becoming part of the background, becoming just how things are. The fish has 3 eyes. That is just how fish are around here. Homer cannot remember things. That is just how Homer is. Burns is over 120 years old. That is just how some people are, apparently. The cooling towers are cracked. Well, the plant has always been there. What are you going to do? This is the show's most sustained and most serious argument. That the most dangerous form of wrongness is the kind that becomes normal. That once a wrong thing has been present long enough, once it has been absorbed into the texture of daily life to the point where people no longer notice it, it becomes not just tolerated but defensible. It becomes part of the definition of how things are supposed to be. And changing it requires not just identifying the wrong thing but unnormalizing it, making it strange again, making it visible to people who have spent their entire lives treating it as furniture. The theories do this work. That is what they are for. They are instruments of unnormalization. They take the things Springfield has decided to treat as background and force them back into the foreground. They make the fish strange again. They make the yellow skin strange again. They make the aging freeze strange again. They make Burns's apparent immortality and Homer's impossible recoveries and the town's collective amnesia strange again, because strange is what those things actually are, and the comfortable numbness of familiarity is what we needed the theories to disrupt. The show will never confirm any of them. The show does not need to confirm them. The theories are not dependent on the show's endorsement. They are dependent on the show's evidence, which is 36 years of accumulated detail that points, consistently and insistently, toward a version of Springfield that is far stranger and darker and more beautiful than the surface suggests. The radiation is there. The coma evidence is there. The conspiracy is there. The collective amnesia is there. The genius hidden behind the pacifier is there. The immortality machine is there. The hidden war and the exile and the 3 generations of damage are all there. They have always been there. The show has been showing them to you since the first episode, not through exposition, not through dramatic reveals, through the slow, patient accumulation of detail that rewards the kind of attention that the show, paradoxically, is specifically designed to make difficult to sustain, because the comedy and the warmth and the comfort of the familiar format are always pulling you back to the surface, away from the evidence that lives below it. But it is there. It has always been there. And now, having spent 4 hours in Springfield, you have seen it. You have walked through the evidence. You have followed the threads from the cracked cooling towers, to the 3-eyed fish, to the yellow skin, to the crayon in the brain, to the exile of the mother, to the impossible age of the employer, to the baby with the gun, to the town that voted to forget, to the man who keeps dreaming and will not wake up. You have been down there. You have seen what the surface covers. And the next time you watch an episode, the next time Homer stumbles through the door after another impossible day at the plant, the next time Maggie watches from her corner with those enormous eyes, the next time Burns looks at Homer and says the wrong name and the audience laughs, you will know what you are looking at. Not a cartoon, not a comedy, not the longest-running animated series in American history doing what it has always done. A story about a family trapped in a loop, in a town that poisons everything it touches, run by a man who has made himself immortal through the same nuclear technology he uses to contaminate his neighbors, frozen at the moment a father went to sleep and could not wake up, kept alive by the specific love that refuses to let the dream end, watched every week by an audience that built the loop and maintains it and returns to it because home, however wrong, is still home. That is The Simpsons. That is what it has always been. And now you cannot unsee it.